Namaste class, I am Dr. Rohit Kumar, your academic counselor, Indira Gandhi National Open University. I am teaching you a paper BPSC 142. Paper name is Indian Foreign Policy in a Globalizing World. In the previous class, we will discuss about block 1 and we will complete we completed block 1 name is introduction and previous class we started block 2 Indian policy towards major powers and completed unit number 5 name is India's policy toward US. Now, today we will discuss about unit number 6, name is India's policy towards Russia, and unit number 7, India's policy towards China. Let's start with unit number 6, name is India's policy toward Russia. This is a major power in the world, and what is the relation between Russia and India we will discuss. There are some objectives of this paper. We First one is the reason for the special position Russia occupies in India's worldview and its external relations. And second one is close cooperation in the political and defense matters. Third one is importance of the Indo-Soviet Treaty of 1971. And fourth one is relations in the past post-Soviet period. And fifth one is basis of the special and privileged strategic partnership and contemporary challenges facing India's relation with Russia. Basically, last one is what kind of challenges facing in contemporary time India's relationship with Russia. Now, moving on to introduction, India's relations with Russia are considered unique in the history of international relations. These ties have not witnessed any major fluctuations with change of governments or even the socio-political system in either country. This is perhaps no other example of two large countries having domestic consensus about their strategic partnership. The two countries have no bilateral issues or threat perception from each other and exhibit mutual trust and confidence in each other's strength. Above all, there is a positive popular perceptions about each other. India and Russia have similar security concerns. They strongly condemn terrorism in all forms and manifestations and call for comprehensive international effort to combat the menace. They have similar position on global hotspots such as Afghanistan, Syria, and others areas. Russia has constitutionally supported India candidature for the expanded United Nations Security Council permanent membership and its as application for NSG members. There is an annual strategic dialogue beside the two countries meet regularly in particularly groupings such as the BRICS and the SCO, Shanghai Cooperation Organization. Both countries call for a multipolar order based on the centrality of the United Nations and rule of law in the international system. Now, influence of socialism and Soviet Union on India. Basically, what was and what is the influence of Soviet socialism in India? We will discuss. India's relation with Russia are generally described as historic, special, close, and friendly. We can say natural partnership describes as historic, spatial, close friendship, friendly, so much so that their strategic partnership has since 2010 come to be defined as a elevated, spatial, and privileged strategic partnership. One has to look into the past to understand this special partnership, socialist and Marxist idea, and the Soviet model inspired many leaders of the Indian freedom struggle, such as Subhash Chandra Bose and Jawaharlal Nehru. Manvendra Nath Roy of India had participated in the Second Congress of the Communist International in 1920 and debated with the revolutionary leader Lenin the questions of his support to the liberation movement in the colonies. After the 1970s, Soviet Revolution, Lenin had come out in support of the right to self-determination for a minority within Europe and the colonized peoples. The first socialist revolution in the world had ignited the desire for freedom and liberation among the colonies in Asia and Africa. Further, world's first socialist revolution has expanded the agenda of many national liberations movements. The goal became not only political freedom from colonial rule but also attainment of social justice and economic development. India was no exception. A number of political parties and groups came to be formed under the influence of socialist ideas. The formation of the Congress Soviet Party, the Communist Party of India, and the Hindustan Socialist Republican Association are some of the examples of the influence. Indian National Congress and its leadership is particular Jawaharlal Nehru uh, were process is not of same degree and scale, while many of the key foreign policy making institutions and individuals are required to give their 100% at the highest scale of their competition in order to work out the nonsense of the policy. Certain institutions are required to just put their stamp on the policy in order to either meet some statutory requirement or give greater legitimacy and acceptability to the policy. Foreign policy making at macro level involve the higher bodies and individuals responsible for giving overall direction and control of the structure and processes of government in the country. The institution and individuals taking part in the process of foreign policy making at this level are the ones who are not expected to be specialists in the theories and practice of diplomacy and foreign policy so as to give their specific inputs into the process of making of impressed by the system of state planning in the building of Soviet socialist economy. After this visit to Moscow in 1927, Nehru wrote the monograph titled All the World is Watching Russia, some with fear and hatred, and other with passionate hope and longing to follow her path. Basically, after the visit to Moscow, Jawaharlal Nehru RPM wrote the monograph title All the World is Watching Russia, some with fear and hatred, and other with passionate hope and longing to follow her path. In a series of articles in 1933, Nehru argued that capitalism has had become outdated and the future belongs to socialism. In particular, he thought of planning as a strategy of development for an independent India. The masses and the elite circles alike shared a sense of empathy and a positive view of the developments taking place in Soviet Union. Land distribution, workers' cooperatives, and state-owned enterprises, and heavy industrialization, universal health, and education, and other social rights, etc. India's political and intellectual class, including writers, poets, and others, had embedded an ig- ingrained socialist ethos of equality, egalitarianism, and social justice with lots of favor free world. Soviet Union had come as an alternative model of development to colonies and people suffering from colonial exploitation and imperialist domination. In India, many thought of socialism as an antidote to the privileging hierarchy and inequality based on caste, creed, and birth, etc. Now we will discuss Indo-Soviet relations initial phase. We will discuss about what was the relation between India and Russia in very initial phase. When India became independent, there was empathy and understanding and a positive view of Soviet socialist model of development. These were the times of Cold War between the two power blocs led by United States of America and the USSR. USSR had launched a number of military alliances to check the growing might of the Soviet Socialist bloc, such as the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, basically named NATO. One similar pact was the Baghdad Pact, later renamed as the Central Treaty Organization, basically CENTO. Pakistan was an important member of CENTO. Pakistan, Iran, Iraq, and Turkey was all frontline state in US bid to deny Soviet Union access to the warm waters of the Indian Ocean and the Persian Gulf. There is an view that the real reason behind India's close ties with the Soviet Union was the growing ties between Pakistan and the US. The real beginning in the state-to-state ties was made during Nehru's visit to Soviet Union in 1955 and the return visit of Soviet leader Nikita Khrushchev and Nikolai Golegin to New Delhi. The Soviet support came into the construction of major steel plant and Bhilai and Bokaro in the late 1950s. With this, Soviet Union became a major partner in India's planning economic development. It helps establish large public sector enterprises during the first and second 5 year plans, basically punctuation 5 year plans. Public sector companies like Bharat Heavy Electrical Limited, name is BHEL, Oil and Natural Gas Corporation (ONGC), and the Hindustan Aeronautics Limited, basically HAL, were built with Soviet assistance. The India-China War of 1962 and the Sino-Soviet political split during 1960s further cemented Indo-Soviet ties. The signing of the Indo-Soviet Treaty of Peace, Friendship, and Cooperation in 1971 was the milestone in the evolving strategic partnership. The treaty provided India with a military defense shield at the time of deteriorating strategic scenario in the South Asian region. The next 2 decades witnessed emergence of close and multifaceted political, economic, and military cooperation. Soviet Union faced multiple economic crises. Soviet socialist economic model had become unsubstantial by 1980s. There were massive failure in economic structure with cost surge, crisis in agriculture and manufacturing outputs, and shortage of foods and consumer goods. Soviet state just could not meet the demand of its various sectors. There was no resources to upgrade industry and agriculture. Mikhail Gorbachev became Secretary General of the Communist Party of the Soviet Union in 1985. He initiated a new thinking and concluded that meeting the economic needs of the people has become more important than the military security of the nation. That ensuring well-being of its own population is more important than economical underwriting the socialist regimes overseas. Gorbachev criticized Brezhnev doctrine, which had asserted that Soviet Union has the right to intervene to protect Soviet governments, socialist government, where, whether, wherever they might be threatened. These policies of the past had resulted in the greater economic cost. There were questions about the quality of Soviet technology too. Cold War perception and policies had led to huge military spending. Some 40 to 50% of annual GDP was reportedly spent on the military defense of the nation and the allies. Soviet intervention in Afghanistan in 1979 had proved extremely costly and militarily demoralizing too. Gorbachev had to rethink of the Afghan imbroglio. He initiated restructuring of the economy. The process was called Petrorkia, policy of perestroika, re-examine the spending of military and other security agencies and age-old system of military support and subsidy to Soviet allies. The restructuring of economic, however, needed flow of capital and technology from the West in order to overcome the structural weakness and backwardness. Attracting attracting Western capital and technology did not prove easy. The structural economic weakness and loopholes in the overall policy framework amidst communist regimes result in the failure with Gorbachev attributes to the bureaucratic credit that he found relation with the developing world of the little used to the Soviet economy. Historically, relation with the third world has proved a drain. He called for an discussion of Glasnost opening. Glasnost was meant to give some political opinion, opinion to the Soviet citizens, freedom of expression, including right to criticism and from political association. This resulted in the birth of autonomous organization in the Soviet society, which started denouncing the military and economic failures of the Union and even communist rule itself. By 1989, GLONASS has spread across the Europe, Eastern Europe and Central Asian region with widespread demonstrations calling for more freedom. The ballistic states of Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania declared independence. Gorbachev refused to provide military support to the communist government in these countries to control their allegations democratic and freedom expressions among the constituent socialist republic of the Soviet Union itself finally result in the dissolutions of USSR in 1991. Now, moving on to India's ties with Russia in the post-Soviet period. The Soviet disintegrations was a big job for Indian policy makers. The security and trade comfort zone has disappeared. Soviet military Soviet military protection under the 1971 treaty was gone, so was the rupee ruble trade. The Indian model of economic development that had worked under heavy state regulation, its license and permit Raj stood exposed in 1991 when the country found that did not have foreign exchange to cover for more than 2 weeks of imports. India placed 79 tons of its reserve to the Bank of England into return for some 405 US million dollar so as to avoid default and on payment on foreign loans. The then finance minister of Manmohan Singh put India on the course of economic liberalization. The world of economic liberalization and globalization was a different world, or assumptions and beliefs were gone. Past post-Soviet Russia and under Boris Yeltsin was also preoccupied with myriad international political and economic problems. Russia was a pale figure compared to its superpower status of the Cold War era. Bilateral relations had declined. More important, their waste has changed. Ideologically, empathy and political affinity was gone. Relations were not pragmatic, even transactional. Towards the end of the 1990s, there was called in Russia policy circle for a pragmatic renewal of relation with India based on realistic possibility and legitimate interest of both sides with an emphasis on economic stimuli. Certain sections in Russia's foreign ministry were against continuity with special relation with India as it might hurt Russia's relations with other South Asian countries. Particularly Pakistan, the special relationship had to go. There were other difficulties, and the two countries had to overcome them before starting on a new course in their bilateral relations. India and Russia signed a new Treaty of Friendship and Cooperation, replacing the 1997 Treaty of Peace, Friendship and Cooperation. Importantly, the security clause of their earliest treaty was deleted. The two countries decided to resolve continuations issue related to debt and ruble rupee exchange rates. A treaty on cooperation in military field was signed as Russian reaffirmed supplies of cryogenic rockets engine to India's notwithstanding US objections in 1994. Indian Prime Minister P.V. Narasimha Rao visits Moscow. The unique Moscow Declaration on protecting the interest of multinational states against the danger of aggressive nationalism, religious extremism, and suppression was signed in March 1997. Indian Prime Minister Devgowda traveled to Russia and important agreement on military cooperation were signed. Russia agreed in principle to receive the 1980 agreement to supply to nuclear power reactor to India. India evinced a renewed interest in Russia when Leonid Primakov was appointed Russian Foreign Minister in 1996 and Prime Minister in 1998 during his visit to India in December 1998. The two countries signed various agreements, including a joint document on the development of Russian-Indian trade and economic, industrial, finance, scientific and technological cooperation and long-term program of military technical cooperation to the years 2010. The visit is remembered for is the proposal for a Moscow visiting the strategic triangle. He wanted Russia's India-China grouping to restore the missing equilibrium in the present international security environment against US unilateralism. In December 2010, the strategic partnership was evaluated to the level of a special privileged strategic partnership. Putin attended the 70th annual summit of the BRICS grouping at Goa from 15 to 16 October 2016 and Indian PM visit Russia in June 2017 to participate in this St. Petersburg's International Economic Forum as the guest of honor. One can safely say that on many global and regional matters, the two have broadly similar positions. The two countries favor a multipolar world system based on prominent role of the UN and international law, common interest, equality, mutual respect, and non-interference in the internal affairs of countries. They support reform of the UN Security Council so that the world body represents the geopolitical relations of the present world. Now, India-Russia coordinations at the UN. Indian foreign policy was based on the concept and practice of non-alignment. It's gave India's freedom to strike out an independent position on global matters of peace and security and be the voice of the developing countries who were more concerned with the threats of neocolonialism, neocolonialism and their continued economic underdevelopment rather than the facile and ideological war between the two superpowers. India independent non-aligned position was reflected in the voting behavior at the UN during 1950 and 1960s. After the Indo-Soviet Treaty of 1971, one could perceive its foreign policy tilt towards Soviet Union in the post-Soviet periods. There is once again a visibly greater connection between India's and the Russian Federation in the UN as compared to India's and US. This is mainly due to the fact that both being economically developing nations have similar interests and viewpoints of global economic order, share many common ideas of matters of international peace and security. There are some matters. Number one is terrorism. India and Russia had supported the UNSC, basically United Nations Security Council resolutions after the 9/11 terrorism attack in US, which was adopted anonymously on 28 September 2001. Both have framed anti-terrorism laws. India come up with the Prevention of Terrorism Act 2002, basically name is POTA, and Russian adopt presidential decree to curb the menace of terrorism in the Russian Republic. Second one is Iran nuclear issues. Iran has been subjected to four rounds of UN Security Council sanctions for its nuclear program between 2006 to 2011, and Russia support the UN Security Council resolutions against Iran. But along with China, it's opposed the unilateralism sanctions on Iran proposed by US, Britain, and Canada at 31st stand 34 UNHRC sanctions. India voted against resolution that criticized Iran. Palestine issues, India as well as Soviet Union, Russian Federation have traditionally supports Arab states and Palestinians against Israel. In view of improvement in relation with Israel, India opposition has seen become more nonsense. However, even now, on many occasions, India voted in favor of Palestinians. Recently, India, along with 128 countries, including Russia, voted in favor of UNGA resolution against US recognition of Jerusalem as the capital of Israel. Similarly, India voted in favor of four resolutions criticizing Israel as at the UNHRC, including those concerning expansion of Israeli settlements and the right of the Palestinian people to self-determination. Russia has also supported such resolution on the Palestine issue at UNHRC. Nuclear proliferation and disarmament. On 2 December 2014, India supports a Russian resolution on no first placement of arms in outer space and the UN General Assembly. India maintained that outer space should not become a field of war and arms race, but a new and expanding frontier of cooperative activity. Environment as major emitters of greenhouse gases, and as developing countries, India and Russia have reservation about the global climate change negotiation in June 2017 during Prime Minister Narendra Modi visits to Russia. Both sides noted that wider use of natural gas in economical and environmental friendly with high potential to assist in fulfilling the provisions of the Paris Agreement on climate change and achieving a sustainable economic growth through sharing of energy efficient skill and technology. Strategic significance of Russia for India. India had core strategic and security issue and Russian support has always been forthcoming on that. Support on Kashmir and terrorism, the Soviet Union, Russian Federation, among major world power, has always understood and supported India's position on Kashmir and terrorism. It's constantly used its veto at the UN Security Council in favor of India on the Kashmir issue. One more than one occasion, Soviet Union Russia has held Pakistan responsible for the spread of religious extremism and terrorism in this part of the world. Russian position on Kashmir is clear as it's a matter of sovereignty for India. Some Russian scholars are of the view that in the changed geopolitical environment of the region, Russia and the China should try to prevent a future conflict between India and Pakistan. Support for India's membership of Security Council. Since the mid 1950s, Soviet Union accepted India as the leader of the Third World and the non-aligned movement. The Russian Federation has continued with the same assessment. Russian acknowledged India as an influential global player of the P5. Russia remains most unequal, unequivocal in the support of India's candidates for permanent membership in an expanded UN Security Council. The vision document issued after the Modi-Putin talk on 1 June 2017 at Petersburg talked about reform in UNSC to make it more representative of contemporary relations and reframes Russia's strong support for India's candidatures for a permanent seat on a reformed UNSC. Now, contemporary concern of India, Sino-Russian ties and Pak-Russian rapprochements. The security situation in Europe and Asia has changed after the annexions of Crimea by Russia and the ongoing conflict in eastern Ukraine, the Western sanctions and the deteriorations in Russia's relation with the US and the West has conceived Russia to pivot to Asia by deepening its engagement with China. The difficult international situation and bad economic conditions have propelled Russia to align with the China. Of particular concern is Russia's willingness to supply China with not just sophisticated weapon but transfer technology to its as well. Relations cannot be described as the alliance and can be seen as partnership of convenience based on mutual interest and authoritarian peace. Russia and China coming together many help Pakistan, which has especially tied with China. Indo-Russian trade, the weakest link in the India-Russia strategic partner is the low level of bilateral trade, estimated at less than $8 billion, much below the target of US 15 to $20 billion fixed during various summits. Indo-Soviet economic and trade relations based on a special government-to-government engagement arrangement come to the end with the disintegration of Soviet Union and transition of Russia from a socialist to a market economy, which coincided with the launch of Indian economic liberalization. The two countries switched from the traditional ruble rupee to trade to hard currency-based trade and reached agreement about repayment of civilian and military loans which had taken from the former USSR. However, annual bilateral Indian-Russia trades remain under 10 billion US dollar. There can be many reasons for this. The Indian exporters to Russia complain about lack of market analysis, long route for transportations, in- inadequate banking system, tariff policy, and regulatory regimes, strong competition in terms of quality and price, and inadequate distribution system prospect of Indian-Russia relations. Several initiatives are on the anvil for cooperation now and the future. Basically, number one is energy cooperation. Second one is nuclear energy. Third one is international north-south transport coalition. This is the major role play in the future relation between Russia and India. We discuss about lack of economically available trade routes in considered a major hurdles in Indian economic interaction with Russia. In September 2000, the two countries along with Iran had signed an agreement in St. Petersburg for the development of the north-south corridor to provide an alternative transport route for trade between India and Central Asia and Europe. It will connect India to Central Asia and Northern Europe through Iran and Russia. The INSST can handle 20 to 30 million tons of goods per year, according to a study conducted by the Federation of Frigate. The launch of the Green Corridor project for customs facilitations in September 2016 is another important step for better connectivity and trade facilitations. Other areas of potential cooperation and dedicated freight corridor, modernization of railway stations, and training of railways personnel, which would further facilitate transports and logistics. Let's sum up. Let's sum up. For India, Union is an important pillar of its foreign policy. The relations between the two countries are based on historical ties, common security and economic interest, as well as common strategic perceptions and political ideological orientations. In the past Soviet period, after some hiccups, India has created a new framework of relation with Russia based on similar position on the number of global and regional issues. Indo-Russian trade in modest, but Russia is vital for India's military readiness as energy security. Despite the growing ties with China and to a lesser extent with Pakistan, India still considers Russia as a very important partner as Russia has constituently stood by India on national security and strategic issues and supported prominent role for India in international relations and Asian affairs. Now we will start new unit name is India's policy towards unit number 7. There are some objectives related to this unit. Number one is important of importance of neighborhoods and dynamics of India-China bilateral relations. Second one is political and strategic relations between India and China, evolution and content of Indian-China policy, economic and trade relations, and summing up the India-China relations. Introductions: India and China are civilizations nation. That two nations share more than 5,000 years of unbroken history, culture, and economic exchange over millennia, and have been among the main source of the world's heritage and culture. Speared by the Himalayas, they share a 3,488 kilometers long borders. The two countries share a border with Bhutan and Nepal. India maintained the Aksai chain in illegally occupied by the PRC. China and India also dispute most of the Arunachal Pradesh. Nevertheless, both countries have agreed to respect the line of actual control, basically named is LAC. Through the relationship has been generally cordial, there are border disputes and economic rivalry between them have had sometimes led to strained relations. The modern relationship began in 1950s when India decided to end formal ties with the Republic of China and recognize the PRC as the legitimate government. India and China are the two highest populated and fast growing significant economics in the economies in the world. Improvement in equality of diplomatic and economic influence has only increased the significance of their bilateral relationship. Culture and economic relations between China and India began countries also spared of Buddhism and trade was facilitated through the Silk Route. China's growing opium trade with the East India Company during the 19th centuries led to First and Second Opium Wars. Both India and China played a crucial role in checking the military expansions of Imperial Japan during the Second World War. Jawaharlal Nehru based his vision of resurgent Asia on friendship between India and China. He initially believed this vision on an internationalist foreign policy governed by the ethics of the Panchil Five Principle of Peaceful Coexistence was shared by China. Nehru was disappointed when it became clear that the two countries had a conflict of interest in Tibet. Most noticeable features of relation between India and China since the Second World War was border issue that caused three military disputes: the Sino-China War of 1962, the Chola incident in 1967, and the 1987 Sino-India screams. There was a clash of Doklam in 2017. Nevertheless, there is a visible improvement in diplomatic and economic relation between the two countries since 1980s. China became India's largest trading partner in 2008. In recent years, there is also a noticeable extension of their strategic and military relations. Besides trade and commerce, there are other issues of mutual interest like climate change and reform of the global financial order, in which both India and China are cooperating. The two countries have not resolved their border dispute, and India has experienced China military influence in India territory. Both countries have steadily established military infrastructures along border areas. India remains concerned about China's strong strategic bilateral with Pakistan. India-China's policy. India's public perceives, uh, perceives China as an authoritarian communist legacy that continue to progress as a strong and powerful country in the neighborhood. In India's consideration, China is a strong neighboring country and already arriving on the global political stage as a superpower. The Tibet episode, the 1962 war, and the constraining developing path over the decades have contributed to India's changed outlook. Essentially, India's current perception of China is that it's more of a powerful of neighbors than a reliable partner. Many Indians opinion leaders feel India need to come out with the China policy with a multiple prism of competition, cooperation, correlation, and coexistence, collaboration, and conflict. But there need to be a reciprocations giving India increasing global stakes. It is expected that China acknowledgement that India is also a power to be reckoned reckoned with. China has emerged as a strong military and political power. Indian business community perceived China more an opportunity, whereas the think tank and the media visualized China more as a strategic concern. Further, the Indian government maintained a safe middle course. China currently is too strong, both politically and militarily, compared to India, given the two countries' identical strategic interest in regional and global domain. The Indian policy appears to remain cautious, courteous and watchful of Chinese move. Both countries heavily depend on resources for development, which to a fair extent shapes their mutual perceptions. For India, China is still a security concern, especially on territorial and maritime domains. Thus, China poses multiple concerns and challenges to India's political, economic, and strategically beside militarily. The People's Liberation Army inflicted the final defeats on culminating nationalist Comunita in October 1949, and PRC was born as a socialist republic some 2 years after India had gained independence. Indian first Prime Minister Jawaharlal Nehru had based his vision of a resurgent Asia on friendship between India and China, and his vision of Indian foreign policy was governed by the ethics of the Panchsheel, which he initially believed was also shared by China. Nehru was disappointed when it was realized that the two countries had a conflict of interest in Tibet issue of Tibet. India established diplomatic relations with PRC on 1st January 1950. Chinese Communist Party chairman Mao Zedong, Mao Zedong considered Tibet as an integral part of PRC. Chairman Mao saw Indian concern over Tibet as a manifestation of interference in the internal affairs of the PRC. The PRC reversed control over Tibet and Lamanism and feudalism, which it did by the force of arms in 1950 to avoid going the PRC. Nehru informed Chinese leader that India had no political and territorial ambitions, expect that traditional trading rights must to be continued with Indian supports. Tibetan delegates signed an agreement in May 1951 recognizing PRC sovereignty but guaranteeing that the existing political and Soviet system of Tibet would continue. Nehru considered that India's best guarantee of security was to establish a psychological buffer zone in place of the lost physical buffer of Tibet. India published new maps in 1954 that included the Aksai Chin region within the boundaries of India. When India discovered that China had built a road through the region, border clashes and Indian protests become common. In January 1959, PRC Primal Zhao Enlai wrote to Nehru emphasizing that no government in China has accepted as legal the McMahon line, which the 1914 Shimla Conventions had defined as the eastern section of the border between India and China, India and Tibet, another. In March 1959, Dalai Lama, the spiritual and temporal head of Tibet, South Sanctuary in Dharamshala, Himachal Pradesh, where he established the Tibetan government in exile. Thousands of Tibetan refugees settled in Himachal Pradesh and Karnataka. Later, the PRC accused India of expansionism and imperialism in Tibet and throughout the Himalayan region. China claimed 104,000 kilometers of territory over which India's map show clear sovereignty and demanded rectification of the entire border issue. Border issues and border disputes resulted in the short border wars between China and India on 20 October 1962, resulting in India defeat as the PRC pushed the Indian force to within 48 kilometers of the Assam plains in the northeast. It also occupied strategic point in the Sky Chin and Damchok regions of Ladakh before declaring a unilateral ceasefire on 21st November. China claimed that is withdraw to 20 kilometers behind as contending lines of control. India disagreed with the claim. Relation between the PRC and India deteriorates during the rest of the 1960s and the early 1970s, while the China-Pakistan relations improved and the Sino-Soviet relations worsened. The PRC backed Pakistan in its 1965 war with India. Between 1967 and 1971, a road to withstand all weather are built across territory claimed by India, linking PRC, Xinjiang, Uyghur Autonomous Region with Pakistan. India could do nothing except protect. An active propaganda campaign was continued by PRC against India. China is a cahort with Pakistan provided financial and other assistance to insurgents group in northeastern India. The PRC accused India of assisting the Kampa rebels in Tibet. Sri Lanka played the role of chief negotiator for the withdrawal of China's troops from the Indian territory. Both India and China agreed to Colombo proposals. In August 1971, India signed its Treaty of Peace, Friendship and Cooperation with the Soviet Union. The PRC seized side with Pakistan in its 1971 war with India. Through China strongly commended India, it did not carry out any threat to intervene on Pakistan's behalf. In subsequent years, both India and China progressed in economic and military areas and meet regularly to discuss and resolve the bilateral issues, including the important border issues, negotiation and agreements. India and the PRC renewed effort to improve relations in 1977 with the Prime Minister Morarji Desai heading the Janata Party government. In 1978, the Indian Minister of External Affairs Atal Bihari Vajpayee made a landmark visit to Beijing. Indian PRC renewed effort to improve relations in 1977 with the Prime Minister Morarji Desai heading the Janata Party government. In 1978, the Indian Minister of External Affairs Atal Bihari Vajpayee made a landmark visit to Beijing and both country officials re-established diplomatic relations. In 1979, the PRC leaders agreed to discuss the boundary issues, it being India's priority as the first step to broadening of relations. The two countries hosted each other's new agencies. The holy sites of Mount Kailash and Mansovar Lake in Tibet were opened for annual Indian pilgrimages. In 1980s, Indira Gandhi approved a plan to upgrade the development of forces around the line of actual control. India also undertook infrastructure development in disputed areas. China troops and not more any further into the valley and instead were forced to withdraw from the valley. A long dialogue process starting in 1981 after the visit of Chinese Foreign Minister Hong Hao, the first Chinese leader to visit India since Zhou Enlai, Zhou Enlai with a 1960s visit to India. India and the PRC had 8 rounds of border negotiation between December 1981 and November 1987. In 1985, the PRC insists on mutual consensus with defining the exact terms of package proposal of where the actual line of control lay. Thus, the negotiation of 1986 and 1987 achieved nothing. Beijing announced in January 1994 that it's not only favored a negotiated solution on Kashmir but also opposed any form of independence from the region. Talks were held in New Delhi in February aimed at confirming established confidence-building measures, discussing clarification of the line of actual control, reductions of armed force along the line and prior information about forthcoming military exercise. China hoped for settlement of the boundaries over retreats. Issues surrounding energy have acquired significance of late. Both countries have growing energy need to sustain continuity economic growth. Both countries signed an agreement in 2006 to investigate ONGC Videsh Limited and the China National Petroleum Corporation to placing joint bid for promising projects. Project. China and India reopened Nathula Pass from trading in 2006. Nathula was closed 44 years prior to 2006. Reopening of border trade is helping easy to economic isol- isolation of the region. The November 2006, China and India had a verbal spate over claim of the northeast Indian state of Arunachal Pradesh. India claimed that China was occupying 38,000 square kilometers of its territory in Kashmir, while China claimed that the whole of Arunachal Pradesh as its own. On 28th August 2017, China and India reached a consensus to put an end to the border standoff. Both agreed to disengage from the standoff in Doklam in February 2019. China made two reported comments on one, objecting PM Modi visit to Arunachal Pradesh, and secondly, India must sign NPT if it wanted entry to nuclear supply groups. Recent terrorist attack in Pulwama and India strikes and Pakistan Balakot received global attention on Pakistan promoting terrorism and calls for actions against Pakistan. China stand by Pakistan position and even blocked UN resolution to designate Jaish Mohammed leader as international terrorist and place a ban. This is a difficult situation for India to deal with. During the Sino-Indian War in 1962, the US provided military supplies to India. This assistance came into the form of small arms, ammunition, and communication system for mountaining warfare. In the short reconciliations period after the Sino-Indian Border War in 1962, the US gave economic assistance for fiscal year 1961 to 1962 and 1963 to 1963 is excess of $2 billion to blunt the communist influence in South of Asia. During the Cold War in 1980s, a change in Indo-US defense operations was visible. In the wake of Soviet intervention in Afghanistan, the United States offered a sell American military hardware to India as well. An Indian team visited to the US in 1980s to explore the possibility of buying anti-tank missiles and long-range howitzers. The Carter's administration has reversed its earlier policy of disapproving the use of an advanced American electronic guiding system in India's Jaguar aircraft. India-China economic relations. The trade and economic relationship between India and China has seen a rapid growth in the last few years. Trade volume between the two countries in 2000 stood at 3 billion US dollar. In 2008, the deficit reached US 58 billion, with China replacing the United States as India's largest goods trading partner. In 2011, bilateral trade reached an all-time high of US 73.9 billion US dollar. Further, the Indian trade deficit with China increased to US dollar. In 2016, India was the seventh largest export destinations for Chinese products and the 27th largest exporter to China. India-China trade in the first 8 months of 2017 was 55.11 billion US dollar. India trade deficit of $61 billion with the China refused to shrink as India is unable to export more manufactured goods. India is welcoming Chinese investment with having huge potential even through its was a mere $2 billion of Chinese FDI in 2017. India and China are neutral trade partners as they complement each other. India is specializing in software, pharma, and IT service, while China is specializing in manufacturing of electronic hardware and infrastructure building. China is India's largest trading partner with bilateral trade reaching among us $72 billion in 2016 to 17. Indian total trade with China for the financial year 2017 to 18 was $84.4 billion and deficit was $51.72 billion. Belt and Roll Initiative, basically name is BRI. At its first at its first convincing in 2017, President Xi Jinping proclaimed China Belt and Road Initiative as the project of the century. The Belt and Road Initiative as an informal coalition with the objective of actualization trillions of dollars for manufacture investment across more than 60 countries. China's grand strategic motivation for the BRI is as much defensive as offensive. China has become the world's largest commodities importer as well as largest exporter of financial goods. Today's world features deterrence and sovereignty, democracy, and transparency that minimize China's ability to dictate matters and terms. The more the BRI becomes a multilateral exercise, the more connects Asian countries to China as well as the rest of the Asians to each other. From Russia and Turkey to India and Iran to Myanmar and Thailand, the discontinuation of multi-directional Silk Road non-dominant power symbolize the return of Asia's past on characterized by different not dominance. As Asia has nearly 5 billion people, of the which about 3.5 billion are not Chinese. Other Asians aspire not to live in China-dominated world order. Many feel India should have signed on BRI, but the overwhelming consideration for India at the time of the BRI initiative in 2017 was that China's Pakistan Economic Cooperation goes through Pakistan occupied Kashmir. India could have also agreed to the recent proposal from China to have the trilateral economic corridor between China, India, and Nepal. While Nepal has signed the trilateral agreement, India was abstaining. It feared that China might dump its goods on India while Nepal. Similarly, India was hesitant to sign the RCEP mega trade treaty involving 16 countries, including both China and India, for the same reason. Now, this unit is also completed and let's uh, let's sum up. India established diplomatic relations with PRC in April 1950. Prime Minister Nehru visited China in October 1954, while the Indian-China border conflict in 1962 was a serious setback to ties. Prime Minister Rajiv Gandhi's landmark visit in 1988 began a new phase of improvement in bilateral relations, focused in India-China tensions in the disputes over territory in the Aksai Chin area and Tabang in the Indian state of Arunachal Pradesh, which China claimed as a part of southern Tibet. Now, India has realized that any war with China would not be in its interest as the China military is far stronger. China also recognized that a conflict with India would adversely affect its multi-faces investment made in India's neighborhood and that the best way forward would to be maintain peace along the border. Further, India has emerged as the important destination for China's goods. In 1993, the signing of an agreement on the maintenance of peace and tranquility along the line of actual control on the Indian-China border areas during Prime Minister Narasimha Rao visit reflected the growing stability and significance in bilateral ties. Both India and China are engaged bilaterally, recognizing and globally. This approach is expected to continue for years to come. In June 2012, China stated its position that Indo-China ties could be the most important bilateral partnership of this century. Indian PM Modi words Asia and the world will have a better future when India and China work together with trust and confidence. Nevertheless, trust deficit and the security dilemma still remains and retains in the bilateral relations between India and China. India understands that any war with China would not be in its interest, seeing the Chinese military is far more superior and stronger. Similarly, it is equally clear to China that a conflict with India would adversely impact its huge investment in India's neighborhood at best way ahead would be to maintain peace. China certainly has access manufacturing capacity and looking for dumping its products in huge India's market. Thus, while involving Indian approach to China has recently shifted from a hard line to the conciliatory approach, one need to watch how the differences play out regionally and globally is in the coming times. Thank you so much. We will meet again in next class. Till now, you will read and write your notes in your notebook. Thank you so much. Namaste.
గుడ్ మార్నింగ్ టు ఆల్. ఈరోజు మనము బిఎస్ఓసి 131 నుంచి ఇంట్రడక్షన్ టు సోషియాలజీ అనే బుక్ నుంచి యూనిట్ నెంబర్ 13 సోషల్ కంట్రోల్ అండ్ చేంజ్. దీన్ని మనం తెలుగులో సామాజిక నియంత్రణ మరియు మార్పు అని అంటూ ఉంటాం అన్నమాట. ఇక్కడ సామాజిక నియంత్రణ అనేది ఈ యొక్క ఒక నిర్దిష్ట మార్గంలో జీవిత విధానాన్ని ఎలా గడపాలి సమాజ సభ్యులు అనేది ఈ సోషల్ కంట్రోల్ మనకి తెలియపరుస్తూ ఉంటుంది అనమాట. ఇది ఎలా తినాలి నుంచి మనకు పెద్దల్ని ఎలా గౌరవించాలి, మరియు రహదారికి ఎడమవైపు డ్రైవింగ్ చేయటము, మరియు భూమి యొక్క చట్టాలు పాటించటము వరకు కావలసిన నియమాలు, విలువైన జీవిత విధానాన్ని ఇది మనకి అందిస్తూ ఉంటుంది అనేది చెప్పుకోవచ్చు అనమాట. ఈ సోషల్ కంట్రోల్ అనేది సామాజిక సభ్యులందరినీ కూడా ఒక నిర్దిష్ట మార్గంలో నడపడానికి నిరంతరము ప్రయత్నిస్తూ ఉంటుంది అనేది ఈ లెసన్ ద్వారా మనము తెలుసుకుంటూ ఉంటాం అన్నమాట. ఆ తర్వాత దీంట్లో సోషల్ కంట్రోల్లో ఈ అనేక రకాల చట్టాలు సమాజ సభ్యులకి ఏర్పరచబడి ఉంటాయనేది కూడా మనం తెలుసుకోవాల్సిన విషయం. సామాజిక జీవనము వ్యక్తిగత ప్రయోజనాల త్యాగాన్ని కోరుకుంటూ ఉంటుంది సహజంగా. కాబట్టి సామాజిక పరిమితులు సందర్భంలో మాత్రమే సమాజ జీవితము సాధ్యమవుతూ ఉంటుంది. ఉదాహరణ తీసుకున్నప్పటికీ ఒకటి, ఎల్లప్పుడూ ఇక్కడ సామాజిక జీవితంలో ట్రాఫిక్ సిగ్నల్ జంప్ చేయబడింది కానీ జరిమానా విధించబడుతుందనే భయంతో అలా చేయలేదన్నమాట ఒక వ్యక్తి. ఎగ్జాంపుల్గా మనం తీసుకుంటే అది ఒక సామాజిక నియంత్రణలో ఒక భాగము. అంటే ఇక్కడ ట్రాఫిక్ సిగ్నల్ జంప్ చేస్తే తప్పనిసరిగా జరిమానా మనం పే చేయాలి. కాబట్టి జరిమానా అది అనేది ఉండటం వల్ల ఇతను జంప్ చేయలేదు అనేది ఇక్కడ ఉదాహరణగా చెప్పవచ్చు. అందువలన సజావుగా మరియు సమర్థవంతంగా పనిచేయటానికి సమాజం కొన్ని నియమాలు మరియు నిబంధనలు చేస్తూ ఉంటుంది అన్నమాట. మరియు దాని సభ్యులు వాటిని అనుసరించాలని ఆశిస్తూ కూడా ఉంటుంది. కుటుంబము, పాఠశాల, మతపరమైన సంస్థలు మరియు మీడియా వంటి సామాజిక సంస్థలు ఈ నిబంధనలకు బలోపేతం చేసి మరింత నిర్వహించే ఏజెంట్లలో కొన్ని అనేక ఆంక్షలు నేరుగా వర్తించవన్నమాట. ఇందులో కొన్ని కానీ సామాజిక వ్యక్తిలో కొన్ని విలువలు పొందుపరచడం ద్వారా మాత్రమే. అందువల్ల చాలామంది వ్యక్తులు భయం వల్ల కాదు కానీ అంతర్గతంగా అలా చేయటానికి కండిషన్ చేయబడతారు. కాబట్టి అత్యంత ప్రాథమిక కోణంలో సామాజిక నియంత్రణ అనేది కోరుకున్న సూత్రాలు మరియు విలువల ప్రకారము తనను తాను నియంత్రించుకునే సామాజిక సామర్థ్యాన్ని ఇది మనకి సూచిస్తూ ఉంటుందనే చెప్పుకోవాలి. ఇక్కడ తర్వాత సామాజిక అర్థము మరియు నియంత్రణ నిర్వచనము ఎలానో ఇప్పుడు తెలుసుకున్నాము. సామాజిక నియంత్రణ యొక్క ఉద్దేశము పదము సూచించినట్లుగా వ్యక్తులపై సమర్థవంతమైన పద్ధతిలో నియంత్రణ కలిగి ఉంటూ ఉంటుందన్నమాట. సమాజం యొక్క నిబంధనలకు అనుగుణంగా నిర్ధారించటము లేదా ప్రవర్తించటము అనుగుణ్యంగా ఇది సూచించబడుతూ ఉంటుంది. అనేక నిబంధనలు సూచిస్తూ ఉంటుంది అన్నమాట. వాస్తవానికి ఒక ఆధునిక సంక్లిష్ట సమాజంలో నిర్దిష్ట సమూహము నిబంధనలు ప్రజలు ఆమోదించేలాగా మరియు అనుసరించేలాగా చేయటం ద్వారా సామాజిక క్రమాన్ని మనము సాధించగలుగుతూ ఉంటాము. ఇక్కడ దానికి సభ్యుల మధ్య సంఘీభావము మరి స్థిరత్వాన్ని కొనసాగించటము ద్వారా సమాజము దాన్ని కొనసాగించటము నిర్ధారిస్తూ ఉంటుందన్నమాట. తత్ఫలితముగా సామాజిక నియంత్రణ సాధనాలు వ్యక్తికి బాహ్యంగా ఏమి ఉండవు అనేది మనం ఇక్కడ గుర్తుపెట్టుకోవాల్సిన విషయము. కానీ తెలియకుండా అనుసరించబడుతూ ఉంటాయి మరియు అతను సంస్కృతిలో వద్ద భాగం అవుతూ ఉంటుంది అనేది కూడా మనం గుర్తుపెట్టుకోవాలి. మరియు ఒక తరం నుంచి మరొక తరానికి ప్రసారం చేయబడుతూ ఉంటాయి ఈ సామాజిక నియంత్రణ పద్ధతులన్నీ కూడా. మరియు ఈ విధములో సామాజిక క్రమము నిర్వహించబడుతూ ఉంటుంది. ఇది సమాజం యొక్క పనితీరులో గందరగోళము మరియు గందరగోళం యొక్క అవకాశాలను డిలిమిట్ చేస్తూ ఉంటుందనేది కూడా మనం గుర్తుపెట్టుకోవాలి. కాబట్టి సామాజిక నియంత్రణ అనేది సామాజిక క్రమంలో తప్పనిసరిగా అవసరమైన భాగంగా మనము గుర్తించవలసిన అవసరము ఎంతో ఉన్నది. ఇక్కడ ప్రసిద్ధమైన గ్రంథమైన సోషల్ కంట్రోల్లో సోషల్ కంట్రోల్ అనే భావన పరిచయం చేసిన అమెరికన్ సోషియాలజిస్టు రాస్ అన్నమాట. రాస్ అనే సోషియాలజిస్టు ఈ సామాజిక నియంత్రణ అనే పదాన్ని మనకి 1901లో ప్రవేశపెట్టారు. అతను సామాజిక నియంత్రణను సమాజము తన సభ్యుల ప్రవర్తన ప్రమాణాలకు అనుగుణంగా తీసుకువచ్చే పరికరాల వ్యవస్థగా ఇతను రూస్ అనే సామాజిక శాస్త్రవేత్త చెప్పారు. అక్బర్న్ మరియు నిమ్కాన్ వంటి ఇతర సామాజిక శాస్త్రవేత్తలు ఈ యొక్క సామాజిక నియంత్రణ అనేది క్రమాన్ని మరియు స్థిరపడిన నియమాలను నిర్వహించబడటానికి సమాజం చేసిన ఒత్తిడి యొక్క నమూనాను సూచిస్తుందని ఈ ఇద్దరు కూడా చెప్పారు, అక్బర్న్ అండ్ నిమ్కాఫ్ అనే సామాజిక శాస్త్రవేత్తలు. పై నిర్వచనాల నుండి సమాజము వ్యక్తి యొక్క ప్రవర్తనపై ఒక రకమైన ప్రభావాన్ని చూపుతుందని ఈ విషయాల వల్ల స్పష్టమవుతూ ఉంటుంది. ప్రజాభిప్రాయము, మతము, నైతికత, భావజాలము లేదా బలవంతము ద్వారా ఈ యొక్క ప్రభావము మనము చూపవచ్చు అనేది కూడా మనం ఇప్పుడు గుర్తుపెట్టుకోవాలి. ఇటువంటి ప్రభావము వివిధ స్థాయిలలో ఉంటూ ఉంటుంది. ఇది సమాజంలోని సభ్యులందరిపై ప్రభావము కావచ్చు, లేదా చిన్న సమూహాలు లేదా వ్యక్తులపై ఆధిపత్య సమూహము యొక్క ప్రభావం కూడా కావచ్చు. కొంతమంది సభ్యులు ఇతరులపై నైతిక అధికారాన్ని కలిగి ఉండటం ద్వారా వారి ప్రవర్తన ప్రభావితం చేస్తూ ఉంటారు. వ్యక్తి లేదా సమూహముపై సమాజం యొక్క ప్రభావము కూడా దయాదాక్షిణ్యాలు మరియు సంరక్షణ అందించే విధానాన్ని కలిగిస్తూ ఉంటుందన్నమాట. దీనివల్ల అనేక రకాల సంరక్షణ పద్ధతులు వెలుగులోకి వస్తూ ఉంటాయి. అందువల్ల సమాజం యొక్క నైతిక నియమావళికి సాంఘీకరణ ఫలితముగా కొంతమంది సభ్యులు ఇతరులకు జాగ్రత్తగా చూసుకుంటూ ఉంటారు. ఈ విధంగా సామాజిక నియంత్రణ అనేది అన్ని రకాల సామాజిక ప్రవర్తనలకు ఆధారంగా మరియు పురాతన కాలం నుంచి ఇటీవల కాలం వరకు అన్ని సమాజంలో ఒక ముఖ్యమైన అంశంగా ఉంటుందనేది మనం ఇక్కడ గ్రహించవలసిన విషయం. ఆ తర్వాత సామాజిక నియంత్రణ రకాలు ఏ విధంగా ఉంటాయో ఇప్పుడు మనము తెలుసుకుందాము. వ్యక్తి లేదా సమూహము యొక్క ప్రవర్తనపై సమాజము అనేక విధాలుగా తమ నియంత్రణను కలిగి ఉంటూ ఉంటుంది. సామాజిక నియంత్రణ స్వభావము, సామాజిక పరిస్థితి మరియు సామాజిక లక్ష్యాలు స్వభావంపై కూడా ఆధారపడి ఉంటూ ఉంటుంది. కొన్ని సరళమైన సమాజాలలో కొన్ని రకాల నమ్మకాలు మరియు ఆచారాలు వ్యక్తులు లేదా సమూహాలపై సామాజిక ఒత్తిడిగా పనిచేయటానికి తగినంత నియంత్రణ కలిగి ఉంటుందనేది కూడా మనము గుర్తించాలి. గ్రామీణ సమాజాలలో చాలా కాలంగా స్థిరపడిన సాంప్రదాయాలు మరియు నమ్మకాలు ఇందుకు మనం ఉదాహరణగా చెప్పుకోవచ్చు. ఇవన్నీ కూడా ఈ యొక్క సామాజిక సమాజాల నమ్మకాలు అనేవి ప్రముఖ పాత్ర వహిస్తూ ఉంటాయి నియంత్రణకు. వ్యక్తి లేదా సమూహం యొక్క ప్రవర్తన ప్రభావము అయినప్పటికీ ఆధునిక పారిశ్రామిక పట్టణ సమాజాలలో ఇది భిన్నంగా ఉంటూ ఉంటుంది. ఇక్కడ రేడియో, టెలివిజన్, పాఠశాల మరియు చట్టము వంటి ఆధునిక సాధనాలు సమాజంలోని సభ్యుల ప్రవర్తనను నియంత్రించే ఉద్దేశంతో మరింత ప్రభావవంతంగా పనిచేస్తూ ఉంటాయని కూడా గమనించవలసిన విషయము. ఒక విధంగా అధికారిక మరియు అనధికారిక అనేది సమాజంలోని సభ్యులపై ప్రభావం చూపటానికి రెండు రకరకాల మార్గాలను మనకి సూచిస్తూ ఉంటాయనేది కూడా మనం ఇక్కడ గుర్తుపెట్టుకోవాల్సిన విషయం. అందువలన సామాజిక నియంత్రణకు ఆధారముగా రెండు ప్రధాన రకాలు వర్గీకరించవచ్చు. అమలు చేయబడిన సామాజిక నియంత్రణ సాధనాలుగా కూడా మనము చెప్పుకోవాల్సిన అవసరం ఉన్నది. ఇక్కడ అధికారిక నియంత్రణ మరియు అనధికారిక నియంత్రణ, ఈ రెండు కూడా ప్రముఖ రకాలుగా ఈ సామాజిక నియంత్రణలో చెప్పుకోవచ్చు. అధికారిక నియంత్రణ కొంతమంది సంస్థాగతంగా అమలు చేయబడుతూ ఉంటుంది. ఇక్కడ ఈ అధికారిక నియంత్రణ చట్టము మరియు చట్టాలను నియంత్రించడానికి ప్రభుత్వము వంటి అధికారము ద్వారా వర్గీకరించబడిన సంస్థలు లేదా సంఘాలు. అధికారిక నియంత్రణ అనేది ఆధునిక పట్టణ సంక్లిష్ట సమాజం యొక్క ఒక ప్రత్యేకమైన లక్షణంగా మనం చెప్పుకోవచ్చు. దీనిలో పరస్పర చర్య చాలా వరకు వ్యక్తిత్వం లేనిది మరియు సామాజిక జీవితము అనామకంగా ఉంటూ ఉంటుందన్నమాట. సంక్లిష్టమైన సమాజానికి దాని సభ్యులకు అనుగుణంగా చేయటానికి అధికారిక నియంత్రణ లేదా నియమాలు మరియు నియంత్రణ అవసరం ఏర్పడుతూ ఉంటుంది. చట్టపరమైన సంస్థ మరియు న్యాయ వ్యవస్థ సామాజిక నియంత్రణకు బాగా గుర్తింపు పొందిన మరియు బాగా ఆమోదించిన సాధనాలుగా మనం చెప్పుకోవచ్చు. వివిధ చట్టాలు నిర్దిష్ట సంస్థచే అమలు చేయబడుతూ ఉంటాయి. ఇందులో అధికారులు నియంత్రణకు అమలు చేయటానికి అధికారం కూడా కలిగి ఉంటూ ఉంటారు. రాష్ట్రం తరచుగా సామాజిక నియంత్రణ యొక్క అత్యధిక ఏజెంట్ మరియు నియంత్రణ అమలు కోసము పోలీసు మరియు మిలిటరీ వంటి అనుబంధ సంస్థలను కలిగి ఉంటుంది. దీని ద్వారా పోలీసు అండ్ మిలిటరీ ద్వారా సామాజిక సమూహాలను కంట్రోల్ చేయడానికి, సామాజిక నియంత్రణ చేయడానికి వీలవుతుందని ఇక్కడ అభిప్రాయంగా చెప్పుకోవచ్చు. ఆ తరువాత అధికారిక నియంత్రణ ప్రధానముగా జానపద మార్గాలు, సాంప్రదాయ విశ్వాసాలు మరియు ఆధారాలు, ఆ యొక్క గాసిప్స్, ప్రజాభిప్రాయము మొదలైన అనధికారిక ఏజెంట్ల ద్వారా వర్గీకరించబడుతూ ఉంటుంది. ఈ పద్ధతుల్లో వర్గీకరిస్తూ ఉంటాం అన్నమాట మనం. ఇక్కడ ఇది నియమాలు, నిబంధనల ద్వారా అమలు చేయబడుతుంది. ఈ యొక్క అనధికారిక పద్ధతి సామాజిక నియంత్రణ యొక్క అనధికారిక మార్గాలు వాటంతట అవి అభివృద్ధి చెందుతూ ఉంటాయన్నమాట. మరియు అవి అంతర్భాగంగా మరియు ఆమోదించబడిన భాగంగా ఉంటూ ఉంటాయి. కొంతకాలం పాటు జీవితము వారు అభ్యాసంతో మరింత స్థిరపడుతూ ఉంటూ ఉంటారు. ఈ ఉల్లంఘించిన సందర్భాలలో వ్యక్తులకు ఇంకా నిర్దిష్ట శిక్ష విధించినప్పటికీ అధికారిక నియంత్రణ కంటే అనధికారిక నియంత్రణలు వారి ప్రభావంలో మరింత ప్రభావవంతంగా ఉంటూ ఉంటాయనేది కూడా మనం ఇక్కడ గుర్తుపెట్టుకోవాలన్నమాట. ఇక్కడ అధికారిక నియంత్రణ కంటే అనధికారిక నియంత్రణ వారి ప్రధాన ప్రభావంలో మరింత ప్రభావవంతంగా సమూహ సభ్యుల్లో మనం చూస్తూ ఉంటాం అన్నమాట. ఇక్కడ సమాజంలోని సభ్యులు సాంప్రదాయ ఆధారితంగా మరియు సంఘము మరింత కఠినంగా ముడిపడి ఉన్న సాధారణ లేదా గ్రామీణ సమాజంలో వారు మరింత ప్రభావవంతంగా ఉంటూ ఉంటారు. వ్యక్తిగత మైదానంలో పరస్పర చర్య ఎక్కువగా జరిగే కుటుంబం వంటి ప్రాథమిక సమూహాలలో కూడా ఇవి మరింత ప్రభావవంతంగా ఉంటూ ఉంటాయి. అనధికారిక నియంత్రణలో నియంత్రణ అంతర్గత విలువల ద్వారా లేదా అవమానము, గౌరవము మరియు అపహాస్యము వంటి భావాల ద్వారా ఇది ఏర్పడుతూ ఉంటుంది అనేది మనం ఇక్కడ తెలుసుకుంటూ ఉన్నాము. ఈ యొక్క సంక్లిష్ట సమాజాలలో మరియు పట్టణ నగర జీవితంలో సామాజిక క్షేమాన్ని నిర్వహించడానికి అధికారిక మరియు అనధికారిక నియంత్రణ యంత్రాంగాలు ఏకకాలంలో కూడా పనిచేస్తూ ఉంటాయి. ఇది ఈ యొక్క సామాజిక నియంత్రణలో అధికారిక అనధికారిక ఏజెన్సీలు సంఘాలు అలా ఉంటూ ఉంటాయి. ఆ తర్వాత సామాజిక నియంత్రణ ఏజెన్సీలు ఎలా ఉంటాయో ఇప్పుడు మనం తెలుసుకుందాము. సమాజము ప్రభావవంతంగా ఉండటానికి కాలక్రమేణా అభివృద్ధి చెందిన ఏజెన్సీల ద్వారా సామాజిక నిర్వహణ నిర్వహిస్తూ ఉంటుంది. సమాజము తన సమాజంలోని సభ్యులపై నియంత్రణ సాధించడానికి జానపద మార్గాలు, మతము, సాంప్రదాయక ఆచారాలు మరిన్ని మొదలైన వాటితో పాటు చట్టము, విద్య, శారీరక బలవంతము మరియు కోడలను ఉపయోగిస్తూ ఉంటుంది. సమాజము ఉపయోగించే సామాజిక నియంత్రణ విధానాల రకాలు దాని సంస్థాగత సంక్లిష్టపరంగా సమాజం యొక్క స్వభావంపై ఇవి ఆధారపడుతూ ఉంటూ ఉంటాయి. చట్టము ద్వారా నియంత్రణ ఆధునిక పట్టణ పారిశ్రామిక సమాజాలలో సామాజిక నియంత్రణకు చట్టము అత్యంత శక్తివంతమైన సాధనం. రాష్ట్రం యొక్క రాజకీయ సమస్యతో సమాజము చట్టము మనకి కనిపిస్తూ ఉంటుంది. చట్టము అనే పదాన్ని వివిధ రకాలుగా నిర్వచిస్తూ ఉంటారు. ఇక్కడ ఈ చట్టాలు రాజకీయ సంస్థ నుంచి వెలువడే సామాజిక పాలన యొక్క ఒక రూపము అని అనేక మంది సామాజిక పండితులు సెలవిస్తూ ఉంటారు. చట్టం యొక్క మూలాలు చాలా ఉంటూ ఉంటాయి. చట్టాలు చేస్తారు. ఈ అనేక రకాల చట్టాలు ప్రభుత్వం ద్వారా, ఏజెన్సీల ద్వారా చేస్తూ ఉంటారు. ఈ యొక్క చట్టాలు సామాజిక సిద్ధాంతాలు, ఆదర్శాలు మరిన్ని ఆధారంగా పనిచేస్తూ ఉంటాయని కూడా మనం ఇక్కడ చూస్తూ ఉంటాము. ఈ యొక్క సరైన చట్టాలను రూపొందించే అధికారం ద్వారా చట్టాలు రూపొందించబడినప్పుడు ఈ యొక్క ఫార్మల్ లాగా ఏర్పడుతూ ఉంటాయి. అధికారిక చట్టాలు ఉద్దేశపూర్వకంగా నిర్దిష్ట ప్రణాళికతో రూపొందించబడతాయి. అధికారిక చట్టాలన్నీ కూడా పాశ్చాత్య వ్యవస్థలో చట్టాలు ఖచ్చితమైనవిగా, స్పష్టముగా మరియు ఖచ్చితమైనవిగా ఉండాలి. మరియు ఒకే విధమైన పరిస్థితుల్లో చట్టము ముందుకు అందరూ సమూలముగా పరిగణించబడుతూ ఉంటారు. చట్టం ముందు అందరూ కూడా ఒకే విధంగా పరిగణించబడుతూ ఉంటారని ఇక్కడ అర్థం చేసుకోవాలి. అయితే యూరోపియన్ కాకుండా ఇతర సంస్కృతుల నుంచి నిర్వర్తించే పాశ్చాత్యేతర చట్టాలను ఇది నిజం కాకపోవచ్చు. ఈ చట్టము ఏజెన్సీలచే అసలు చేయబడుతుంది. ఆ తర్వాత అధికారిక శరీరాలు సృష్టించబడుతూ ఉంటాయి. ఇందు పాశ్చాత్య నాగరికత వ్యాప్తితో అధికారిక చట్టం యొక్క స్వభావము చాలా సమాజాలలో సమానంగా మారిందనేది కూడా మనము చూస్తూ ఉన్నాం అన్నమాట. విద్య ద్వారా నియంత్రణ అనేది చాలా ముఖ్యమైన సాధనంగా చెప్పుకోవాలి. మరియు సమాజంలోని అన్ని రకాలలో సామాజిక నియంత్రణ యొక్క యంత్రాంగము విద్యను కేవలము యువతరాల వారు సామాజిక విలువలు మరియు నిబంధనలకు ఇమిడిపోయేలాగా చూడగలుగుతూ ఉంటామన్నమాట. అనధికారిక విద్య అందరూ సాంఘికీకరణ ఏజెంట్లు, ముఖ్యంగా కుటుంబము ద్వారా అది అందించబడుతూ ఉంటుంది అనేది మనందరికీ తెలిసిన విషయమే అన్నమాట. ఇక్కడ ఎమిలే డుర్కహైమ్ అనే సామాజిక పండితుడి ద్వారా విద్య అనేది ఇక్కడ యువతరం యొక్క సాంఘికీకరణగా భావించబడుతుందని ఎమిలే డుర్కహైమ్ యొక్క అభిప్రాయంగా మనం చెప్పుకుంటూ ఉన్నాం అన్నమాట. ఇక్కడ ఈ యొక్క స్వభావ సాధనాల ద్వారా మరియు సాంకేతిక పుస్తకాలు మరియు ఉపాధ్యాయులు కలిగి ఉన్న ఒక సంస్థ ద్వారా అందించబడేదే విద్య అనేది కూడా ఎమిలే దుర్ఖామ్ అనే సామాజిక పండితుడు మనకి ఈ యొక్క సామాజిక నియంత్రణ పద్ధతుల్లో విద్య యొక్క ప్రాముఖ్యత మీద అతను అనేక సిద్ధాంతాలను వెలువరించారనేది మనం ఇక్కడ చెప్పుకోవచ్చు. ఇది సమాజంలోని ఈ యొక్క సభ్యుల ప్రవర్తనను నియంత్రించడంలో ప్రధాన పాత్ర పోషిస్తూ ఉంటది. అధికారిక విద్య అనేది సమాజంలోని యువకులకు సరైన రకమైన భావజాలాన్ని అందించడానికి రూపొందించబడుతూ ఉంటుందనేది కూడా మనం ఇక్కడ గుర్తుపెట్టుకోవాలి. ఒక ప్రత్యేకమైన భావజాలాన్ని సమాజంలోకి యువకులకు అందించడానికి విద్య అనేది ఒక ప్రత్యేకమైన సాధనంగా, నియంత్రణా సాధనంగా మనం చెప్పుకుంటూ ఉంటామనమాట. ఇక్కడ యువకులకు సరైన భావజాలాన్ని అందించడంతో పాటు వారు దాని పునరుత్పత్తికి దోహదం చేస్తూ ఉంటారనేది కూడా మనం ఇక్కడ గమనిస్తూ ఉంటామన్నమాట. అధికారిక విద్య తరచుగా మతపరమైన మరియు దేశభక్తి విలువలను కలిగి ఉంటూ ఉంటుంది. ఇక్కడ ఇవన్నీ కూడా ఈ విద్య బాధ్యతాయుతమైన పౌరుని ఏర్పాటుకు అనువైనదిగా ఈ యొక్క సామాజిక నియంత్రణలో విద్యకి ఒక ప్రత్యేకమైన భావనని మనం కలిగిస్తూ ఉన్నామనేది గ్రహించవలసిన విషయం. తర్వాత ఇక్కడ ప్రజాభిప్రాయం అనేది ఏదైనా సమస్యపై ప్రజలు వ్యక్తం చేసే ఆలోచనలను సూచిస్తూ ఉంటుంది. నిజానికి ఇది సమాజంలోని మెజారిటీ సభ్యుల సమిష్టి అభిప్రాయాలుగా పనిచేస్తూ ఉంటుంది. అంతేకాకుండా ప్రజాస్వామ్య సమాజాలలో ఇది మరింత విలువైనదిగా చెప్పుకోవచ్చు. ఇక్కడ రేడియో మరియు టెలివిజను మొదలైన వివిధ ఆధునిక మార్గాల ద్వారా ప్రజల అభిప్రాయము సేకరించబడుతూ ఉన్నదనేది కూడా మనం ఇక్కడ గమనించవలసిన విషయము. ఎక్కువగా ఈ యొక్క టెలివిజన్ అండ్ రేడియో ప్రముఖ పాత్ర వహిస్తూ ఉంటాయనేది కూడా మనము చెప్పుకోవాలి. ప్రచారం ద్వారా నియంత్రణ ప్రకారము ప్రజల వైఖరి, ప్రవర్తన మరియు భావజాలాన్ని ఇది నిరంతరము ప్రభావితం చేస్తూ ఉంటుందనేది కూడా మనం తెలియపరచుకోవాలి. కొన్నిసార్లు ఇది పాత నమ్మక వ్యవస్థను కొత్త దానితో భర్తీ చేయడానికి కూడా ఉపయోగపడుతూ ఉంటుంది. అయితే ఇది సానుకూల మరియు ప్రతికూల ఈ యొక్క ప్రభావాన్ని కలిగి ఉండవచ్చు అనేది మనం ఇక్కడ గుర్తుపెట్టుకోవాల్సిన విషయము. చాలా ప్రభుత్వాలు మరియు అధికారిక పాలన ప్రజల ప్రవర్తనలో మార్పులు తీసుకురావడానికి ఈ యొక్క ప్రచారాన్ని ఉపయోగిస్తూ ఉంటారు. ఈ ప్రచారం ద్వారా సమాజంలో మార్పు తీసుకురావాలని వారి యొక్క భావనగా మనం చూస్తూ ఉంటాం. అందువలన సమాజము కోరుకునేది వారికి కూడా మంచిదేనని ఇక్కడ ప్రచారం ద్వారా
হেল্ল' হেল্ল' শুনিছে নেকি? দৃষ্টিভংগীৰ একক নম্বৰ 11 চিত্ৰশিল্পৰ বিষয়ে আমি আলোচনা কৰিম। এই পাঠ্যত চিত্ৰশিল্পৰ প্ৰাধান্য লাভ কৰিব। চিত্ৰশিল্প এনে এটা শিল্প যাৰ যোগেদি আমি বিভিন্ন অংগী ভংগী বা তাৰ চলন ফুৰণ বিভিন্ন ধৰণে প্ৰকাশ কৰিব পাৰোঁ, ভাষা প্ৰকাশ কৰিব পাৰোঁ। চিত্ৰশিল্পৰ যোগেদি চিত্ৰই বহুত কথা কয়। চিত্ৰৰ যোগেদি আমি বহুত জ্ঞাত লাভ কৰোঁ। চিত্ৰৰ বিভিন্ন প্ৰকাৰত তাক চিত্ৰাংকিত কৰিব পাৰি। চিত্ৰৰ যোগেদি আমি বিভিন্ন দিশত আমি শিক্ষাৰ ক্ষেত্ৰতো হওক, আমি আমাৰ পাঠ যেতিয়া আমি পাঠ এটা আমি পাঠদান কৰোঁ তাৰ সময়তো আমি বিভিন্ন ধৰণৰ আমাৰ এটা এইডছ হিচাপে আমি চিত্ৰশিল্প ব্যৱহাৰ কৰিব পাৰোঁ সেই পাঠটিৰ লগত সম্পৰ্ক ৰাখি। তো চিত্ৰৰ পৰা আমি বিভিন্ন দিশত বিভিন্ন ব্যৱহাৰ কৰিব পাৰোঁ আৰু চিত্ৰই আমাক বহুত কথা আমাক কৈ যায়। এই পাঠটিত এতিয়া আমি ইয়াৰ পাঠটি পঢ়াৰ উদ্দেশ্যৰ বিষয়ে আমি জানিবলৈ যত্ন কৰিম। এই পাঠটিৰ পঢ়াৰ মূল উদ্দেশ্য হৈছে এই এককত আমি এই ভাৰতৰ প্ৰাগৈতিহাসিক যুগৰ পৰা বিকাশৰ চিত্ৰসমূহৰ বিষয়ে আলোচনা কৰিম। অৰ্থাৎ ভাৰতত প্ৰিহিষ্টৰিক যুগৰ পৰা এতিয়ালৈকে যিমানখিনি চিত্ৰশিল্পৰ বিকাশ হৈছে, ডেভেলপমেণ্ট হৈছে, সেই বিষয়ে আমি পৰ্যায়ক্ৰমে আলোচনা কৰিম। কিন্তু কথাটো হ'ল কি, আমি সকলো বিষয়ে সামৰি ল'ব নোৱাৰোঁ। যিখিনি সম্ভৱ সেইখিনি ইয়াত আমি সামৰি লৈছোঁ, আৰু সেইখিনি বিষয়ে আমি ইয়াতে বিতংভাৱে আলোচনা কৰিম। এই পাঠটো পঢ়াৰ পিছত আমি কিছু কথা জানিবলৈ সক্ষম হ'ম। যেনে ভাৰতীয় চিত্ৰশিল্পৰ সৌন্দৰ্যবোধ আমি বুজিবলৈ পাম, যে তাৰ এস্থেটিক ভিউ, চিত্ৰ এটা নান্দনিক দৃশ্য বা চিত্ৰ যোগেদি কেনেধৰণে চিত্ৰায়িত শিল্পীয়ে চিত্ৰায়িত অংকন কৰি চিত্ৰায়িত কৰিব খুজে, কি বুজাব খুজিছে, তেওঁৰ ভাষা সৌন্দৰ্য আমি বুজিবলৈ সক্ষম হ'ম। চিত্ৰশিল্পৰ মূলনীতি এই বিষয়ে আমি জানিব পাৰিম। চিত্ৰশিল্পৰ বিষয়বস্তু সম্বন্ধে আমি জানিব পাৰিম। চিত্ৰশিল্পৰ ঐতিহাসিক পৰিপ্ৰেক্ষিতত আমি জানিব পাৰিম। হিষ্টৰিকেল পইণ্ট অফ ভিউত চিত্ৰশিল্পৰ গুৰুত্ব, চিত্ৰশিল্পৰ প্ৰয়োগ বা চিত্ৰশিল্প কোনে কেনেধৰণে তাক চিত্ৰায়িত কৰিছে, এই বিষয়ে আমি জানিবলৈ সক্ষম হ'ম। ভাৰতৰ বিভিন্ন অংশৰ মুখ্য চিত্ৰশিল্পীৰ শৈলী আৰু কেন্দ্ৰসমূহৰ বিষয়ে আমি পৰিচিত হ'ম। অৰ্থাৎ ভাৰতৰ বিভিন্ন অংশত বিভিন্ন ধৰণৰ চিত্ৰশিল্পীৰ তেওঁলোকৰ শৈলী, যিটো ষ্টাইল, আৰু বিভিন্ন ধৰণৰ কেন্দ্ৰ যি গঢ় লৈ উঠিছিল চিত্ৰশিল্পৰ বিকাশৰ কাৰণে, সেই বিষয়ে আমি জানিব পাৰিম এই পাঠটো পঢ়াৰ পিছত। তাৰপিছত আমি এই পাঠটোৰ উদ্দেশ্য আগত ৰাখি আমি এই পাঠে এটা চমু পৰিচয় আগবঢ়াবলৈ ওলাইছোঁ। আৰু এই পৰিচয়ৰ ভিতৰত ভাৰতত চিত্ৰশিল্পৰ এক দীঘলীয়া আৰু সমৃদ্ধ পৰম্পৰা আছে। অৰ্থাৎ চিত্ৰশিল্প আজিয়ে ভাৰতত অহা নাই। চিত্ৰশিল্প প্ৰিহিষ্টৰিক বুৰঞ্জী লিখাৰ আগৰ পৰাই, বুৰঞ্জী কাল আৰম্ভ হোৱাৰ আগৰ পৰাই চিত্ৰশিল্প ভাৰতত প্ৰচলিত হৈ আছে, আৰু এতিয়াও আছে। আৰু ইয়াৰ যিটো সমৃদ্ধি কৰিছে আমাৰ পৰম্পৰাক বা আমাৰ কালচাৰ ডেভেলপ কৰিছে, সেই বিষয়ে আমি এই পাঠটোৰ যোগেদি জানিব পাৰিম। প্ৰাৰম্ভিক সময়ত ধৰ্মীয় পৌৰাণিক কাহিনীৰ ওপৰত আধাৰিত চিত্ৰশিল্প প্ৰধান আছিল। তো এটা সময়ত চিত্ৰশিল্পৰ এটা বেলেগ ৰূপত আছিল, অৰ্থাৎ ধৰ্মীয় ধৰ্মৰ লগত তাৰ জড়িত হৈ পেলাই চিত্ৰশিল্পীয়ে অংকন কৰিছিল। পৰৱৰ্তী সময়ত, পিছৰ সময়ত ৰজাৰ দৰবাৰতো ইয়াক এটা জীৱন চিত্ৰণত প্ৰধানতা লাভ কৰিছিল। ৰাজদৰবাৰতো চিত্ৰ চৰ্চা হৈছিল, পেইণ্টিঙৰ ব্যৱহাৰ হৈছিল, তাত বিভিন্ন ধৰণৰ চৰ্চা হৈছিল, বিভিন্ন কামত প্ৰয়োগ কৰা হৈছিল। তাৰপিছত আমি দেখিব যে আমি চিত্ৰশিল্প প্ৰথমতে দেৱালত সামূহিকভাৱে চিত্ৰ অঁকা হৈছিল, অৰ্থাৎ ৱালত, বেৰবোৰত চিত্ৰশিল্প তাত চিত্ৰাংকিত কৰা হৈছিল, আৰু তাৰ দৰে পৰা বিভিন্ন ধৰণৰ মেছেজ দিবলৈ যত্ন কৰা হৈছিল। তাৰপিছত আমি দেখিবলৈ পাইছোঁ যে পিছৰ পৰ্যায়ত পুস্তকৰ পৃষ্ঠাত চিত্ৰাংকনৰ প্ৰচলন পৰৱৰ্তী যুগত দেখা যায়, যে পিছত যেতিয়া কিতাপ আহিল, কিতাপতো চিত্ৰ দেখিবলৈ পালোঁ। চিত্ৰ প্ৰয়োগ কৰা হ'ল, চিত্ৰৰ যোগেদি বিভিন্ন কথা বুজাই দিয়া হ'ল। চিত্ৰত যিখিনি থাকে সেইখিনি তাৰ এটা ভাষা থাকে। চিত্ৰৰ পৰা আমি ভিজুৱেলি আমি বহুত কথা আমি জানিব পাৰোঁ, বুজিব পাৰোঁ, তাত শিল্পীয়ে কেনেধৰণে তাক ৰূপ দিব খুজিছে। তাৰপিছতে চুলতানী আৰু তাৰ পিছৰ সময়ত ব্যক্তিগত শিল্পীসকলে স্বাক্ষৰিত প্ৰতিচ্ছবি আঁকিছিল। অৰ্থাৎ চুলতান যুগত বা তাৰ পিছৰ সময়ত শিল্পীসকলে চিত্ৰাংকন কৰিছিল, তেওঁলোকৰ প্ৰতিচ্ছবিবিলাকৰ তেওঁলোকে যিবিলাক আঁকিছিল তাত স্বাক্ষৰিত কৰিছিল। তাৰপিছৰ পৰ্যায়ত আমি দেখিম ভাৰতীয় চিত্ৰশিল্পৰ নিজৰ বিশেষত্ব আছে। নিশ্চিতৰূপে ভাৰতীয় চিত্ৰশিল্পৰ নিজা বৈশিষ্ট্য আছে, চৰিত্ৰ আছে, নিজত্ব আছে, আৰু ঠিক তেনেকৈ পাশ্চাত্য চিত্ৰশিল্পৰো আছে। কিন্তু ভাৰতীয় চিত্ৰশিল্প আৰু পাশ্চাত্য চিত্ৰশিল্পৰ মাজত আমি পাৰ্থক্য দেখিবলৈ পাম। ঠিক এই পৃথক বৈশিষ্ট্যই বহুসংখ্যক সাংস্কৃতিক পৰিচয়, অৰ্থাৎ পাশ্চাত্য চিত্ৰশিল্প আৰু ভাৰতীয় চিত্ৰশিল্পৰ যাৰ বেলেগ বেলেগ বৈশিষ্ট্য আছে, স্পেচিয়েলিটি আছে, আৰু তাৰ ফলত কি হৈছে, আমি যদি চাওঁ টুৰিজিমৰ ফালৰ পৰা, পৰ্যটনৰ ফালৰ পৰা, তো ইয়াত বিভিন্ন ধৰণৰ সাংস্কৃতিক অৰ্থাৎ কালচাৰেল যিবিলাক পৰ্যটক থাকে, যিবিলাকে সেই ধৰণৰ অধ্যয়ন বা জ্ঞান লাভ কৰিবলৈ তেওঁলোকক আকৰ্ষণ কৰে, কাৰণ তাত ডিফাৰেঞ্চ আছে। কম্পেয়াৰ কৰিব পাৰোঁ আমি পশ্চিমীয়া চিত্ৰশিল্প কেনেধৰণে হয়, তাত কি ব্যৱহাৰ হয়, ভাৰতীয় চিত্ৰশিল্প তাৰ থিমটো কি, ভাৰতীয় চিত্ৰশিল্পৰ থিমটো কি, সম্পূৰ্ণ বেলেগ বেলেগ ধৰণে তাক চৰ্চা কৰা হয়। তাৰপিছত আমি আহিম এই সৌন্দৰ্যবোধলৈকে। চিত্ৰ হৈছে এটা সৌন্দৰ্যৰ প্ৰতীক, তাৰ এস্থেটিক ভিউ আছে, তাত সৌন্দৰ্যবোধ আছে। চিত্ৰ যোগেদি আমি এটা বেলেগ এটা সৌন্দৰ্য লাভ কৰিবলৈ সক্ষম হওঁ। চিত্ৰশিল্প হৈছে অনুভৱ আৰু চিন্তাৰ বহিঃপ্ৰকাশ, অৰ্থাৎ আমি যি অনুভৱ কৰোঁ, আমি যি চিন্তা কৰোঁ, তাতে বহিঃপ্ৰকাশ কৰে। তাত পেঞ্চিলত হওক বা তাত কালাৰত হওক, তাৰ বহিঃপ্ৰকাশ ঘটে, আৰু তাৰ যোগেদি চিত্ৰশিল্পীয়ে যিটো ভাবিছে বা যিটো চিন্তা কৰিছে তাক দেখিবলৈ পোৱা যায়। যি এটা দুমাত্ৰিক দৃশ্য ভাষাৰ জৰিয়তে সুন্দৰতাৰ আৰু অনুভূতি বনাব পাৰে। অৰ্থাৎ দ্বিমাত্ৰিক দ্বৈত এটা চিত্ৰত আমি দুটা বস্তু দেখিবলৈ পাওঁ যে তাত এলিমেণ্ট অফ লেংগুৱেজ আমি তাত দেখিবলৈ, আমি তাত শ্বেপ দেখিব পাওঁ, আমি তাত কালাৰ দেখিবলৈ পাওঁ। আৰু এই ভাষাৰ উপাদানবোৰ হ'ল যাত আমি ভাষা মানে লেংগুৱেজ, চিত্ৰ এটাৰ যোগেদি আমি যিটো কথা প্ৰকাশ কৰিব খুজিছোঁ তাত আমি দেখিবলৈ পাওঁ যে এই শ্বেপ, যাক আমি ৰূপ বুলি কৈছোঁ, ৰেখা, ৰং, গাঢ়তা, এইবিলাক একেলগে এটা মিলি স্থান, গতি আৰু পোহৰৰ অনুভূতি সৃষ্টি কৰে। এটা সকলোৰে সংমিশ্ৰণ এটা সুন্দৰ আৰু চিত্ৰৰ সৃষ্টি হয়। আৰু সেই চিত্ৰত তাৰ বিভিন্ন ধৰণৰ শ্বেপ দিয়া হয়, তাত বিভিন্ন ধৰণৰ ৰেখা অংকন হয়, তাত বিভিন্ন ধৰণৰ ৰং ব্যৱহাৰ হয়, তাত বিভিন্ন ধৰণৰ আমি দেখিবলৈ পাওঁ যে কালাৰ, টোন, টেক্সচাৰ্ছ আমি দেখিবলৈ পাওঁ। তো এটা অদ্ভুত ধৰণৰ আমি সৃষ্টি তাত সৌন্দৰ্যৰ ওপৰত আমি উপলব্ধি বা অনুভৱ কৰিবলৈ আমি সক্ষম হওঁ। আৰু গতি আৰু পোহৰৰ অনুভূতি তাত সৃষ্টি হয়। তাৰপিছত আমি দেখিবলৈ পাম চিত্ৰশিল্পই এই বাস্তৱ আৰু অপ্ৰাকৃতিক ঘটনা, চিত্ৰণ, কাহিনীৰ ব্যাখ্যা অথবা সম্পূৰ্ণ বিমূৰ্ত চিত্ৰৰ ৰূপত দৰ্শায়। অৰ্থাৎ এটা চিত্ৰই আমাক বাস্তৱৰ কিছুমান আমাৰ বিষয় উপস্থাপন কৰে। ই প্ৰাকৃতিকেই হওক বা অপ্ৰাকৃতিক হওক, তাক চিত্ৰণ কৰা হয়। বিভিন্ন কাহিনী চিত্ৰৰ যোগেদি আমি যিবিলাক এতিয়া আজি কাৰ্টুনবিলাক চলে তাত বেছিভাগ চিত্ৰ আমি দেখিবলৈ পাওঁ। সেই চিত্ৰৰ যোগেদি বিভিন্ন ধৰণৰ আমি এই কথা আমি বুজিবলৈ সক্ষম হওঁ, মেছেজ আমি পাবলৈ সক্ষম হওঁ। আৰু সম্পূৰ্ণ তাৰ এটা ৰূপত আমি চিত্ৰৰ ৰূপত আমি দেখিবলৈ পাওঁ। শিল্পীৰ যিটো মেছেজ, যিটো তেওঁ বাৰ্তা দিব খোজে, এই দৰ্শকৰ ওচৰলৈ যায় চিত্ৰৰ মাধ্যমত তেওঁ এটা বাৰ্তা পঠাবলৈ সক্ষম হয়। তাৰপিছত কলা পদ্ধতি আৰু ৰূপৰ সংবেদনশীলতা আৰু সীমাবদ্ধতাৰ জৰিয়তে, নিশ্চিতভাৱে তাত সীমাবদ্ধতা থাকিবই, তাৰ লিমিটেশ্যন থাকিবই, তথাপিতো তাৰ মাজেদি চিত্ৰৰ মেছেজ এটা গুচি যায় তাৰ মাধ্যমেদি এই চিত্ৰ ব্যৱহাৰকাৰীৰ ওচৰলৈকে। তাৰপিছত আমি দেখিবলৈ প্ৰাৰম্ভিক সময়ত জনজাতি ধৰ্ম, ৰাজদৰবাৰ আৰু ৰজা চিত্ৰশিল্পৰ আকাৰ, বিষয়বস্তু আৰু উদ্দেশ্য নিৰ্ধাৰণ কৰিছিল। অৰ্থাৎ আৰম্ভণিতে এনেধৰণৰ আছিল যে তাত কিছুমান বাধ্যবাধকতা আছিল। প্ৰাৰম্ভিক সময়ত জনজাতিবিলাকে চিত্ৰৰ লগত জড়িত হৈছিল। ধৰ্মৰ লগত বিভিন্ন ধৰণৰ তাৰ নিৰ্দেশনা থাকে। হিন্দু ধৰ্ম বুলি ক'লে, খ্ৰীষ্টান ধৰ্ম বুলি ক'লে, জৈন ধৰ্ম বুলি ক'লে, বৌদ্ধ ধৰ্ম বুলি ক'লে, তাৰ প্ৰতীক বেলেগ, তাৰ চিন্তা বেলেগ, এই তেনেধৰণৰ। তাৰপিছত ৰাজদৰবাৰ, ৰজাৰ দৰবাৰতো বিভিন্ন ধৰণৰ চিত্ৰ অংকন কৰা হৈছিল। আমি বিভিন্ন ধৰণৰ কেতিয়াবা কেনেকুৱা স্কেটছ আমি এতিয়াই দেখিছোঁ, পেহেলগামত যিটো ঘটনা ঘটিছে তাত প্ৰত্যক্ষদৰ্শীয়ে যিবিলাক বিৱৰণ দিছে তেনেকৈ তাত স্কেটছ বনোৱা হৈছে, তেওঁলোকক আইডেণ্টিফাই কৰাৰ কাৰণে যত্ন কৰিছে। অৰ্থাৎ চিত্ৰ এটা যোগেদি আমি এটা নকল কৰিব পাৰোঁ তাৰ সেই মানুহজনৰ, আৰু তাৰ পৰা আমি বুজিব পাৰোঁ যে সেই ধৰণৰ মানুহ এজনে তাত জড়িত হৈ আছে। গতিকে চিত্ৰৰ পৰাই আমি এতিয়াও আমি কাৰোবাক বিচাৰি উলিয়াত আমাক সহায় হ'ব বা বুজাত সহজ হ'ব। গতিকে ৰাজদৰবাৰতো তেনেকৈ বিভিন্ন কাৰণত চিত্ৰৰ ব্যৱহাৰ হৈছিল, তাত স্কেটছ বনোৱা হৈছিল বা আইনী কাৰণতো চিত্ৰৰ প্ৰয়োগ হৈছিল। গতিকে আৰু ৰজা চিত্ৰশিল্পৰ তেওঁলোকৰ আকাৰ, বিষয়বস্তু আৰু উদ্দেশ্য নিৰ্ধাৰণ, অৰ্থাৎ তাৰ কেনেধৰণৰ ষ্টেপ হ'ব, কি ধৰণৰ হ'ব, তাত বিষয়বস্তু কি, তাত কণ্টেণ্ট কি থাকিব, তাৰ উদ্দেশ্য কি, সকলোবোৰ নিৰ্ধাৰণ কৰিছিল। শিল্পীক মূলতঃ কৌশলী শিল্পী হিচাপে বিবেচনা কৰা হৈছিল আৰু ব্যক্তিগত সৃষ্টিশীলতাক স্বীকৃত হোৱা নাছিল। অৰ্থাৎ সেই সময়ত যিটো ৰজাই ব্যৱহাৰ কৰিছিল শিল্পীসকলক, তো সেই সময়ত শিল্পীসকলক বিশেষ স্বীকৃতি দিয়া হোৱা নাছিল, ৰজাৰ কামত লগোৱা হৈছিল। আৰু ৰজাই যিধৰণে তেওঁলোকক কামত লগাইছিল সেইধৰণে তেওঁলোকে ৰজাৰ ওচৰত তেওঁলোকৰ যিটো কৌশলী, তেওঁলোকৰ স্কিল আছিল, সেইটো তেওঁলোকে তাত ব্যৱহাৰ কৰিছিল আৰু তেওঁলোকে তাত প্ৰতিফলিত কৰিবলৈ যত্ন কৰিছিল। তাৰপিছত দেখিম আমি যে সৌন্দৰ্যবোধ আমি বুলি ক'লোঁ, কিন্তু সৌন্দৰ্যবোধনো কি, তাৰ অৰ্থ কি, তাৰ ডেফিনেশ্যন কি? আমি এতিয়া কথা হ'ল কি, সৌন্দৰ্যবোধ আমি কি আঁকিম, কেনেকৈ আঁকিম আৰু কিয় আঁকিম, আঁকিম কিয় সেইটো আমাৰ মনলৈকে আহিব, কেনেকৈ আঁকিম, তাৰপিছত আঁকিম কি আমি। তো এনেধৰণৰ আমাৰ বিভিন্ন প্ৰশ্ন আমি বিচাৰ কৰোঁ, আৰু এই বিচাৰ কৰা বিষয়টো হৈছে সৌন্দৰ্যবোধৰ মূল বিষয়বস্তু। যিবিলাক প্ৰশ্ন আমাৰ মনলৈকে আহিব সেই বস্তুৰ উৎঘাটন কৰাটোৱেই হ'ল সৌন্দৰ্যবোধৰ মূল বিষয়বস্তু। ঠিক তেনেকৈ সৌন্দৰ্যবোধ বুলিলে সাধাৰণতে সুন্দৰতাৰ বিজ্ঞান বুলি কোৱা হয়, অসুন্দৰতাৰ বিজ্ঞান বুলি কোৱা হৈছে সৌন্দৰ্যবোধক। তো ইয়াতে আমি এই শাখাত শিল্পৰ দৰ্শন, মনস্তত্ব আৰু সমাজতত্বৰ সৈতে জড়িত অনুভৱসমূহ অধ্যয়ন কৰিম। তো এই যিটো শাখা শিল্পৰ দৰ্শন, ফিলচফিক এটা দৰ্শন লৈ আমি কাম কৰিব লাগিব, এটা দিশ আগত লৈ আমি কাম কৰিব লাগিব, তো এটা ষ্টাইল আমি লৈ কাম কৰিব লাগিব। শিল্পৰ মনস্তত্ব, তাত চাইকলজিৰ কথা থাকিব, তাত সমাজতত্বৰ কথা থাকিব, সমাজৰ লগত তাৰ সুসম্পৰ্ক থাকিব লাগিব, তাত চাইকলজিকেলি আমি তেনেধৰণৰ এটা ৰূপ দিবলৈ আমি প্ৰস্তুত হ'ব লাগিব, আৰু তাত জড়িত অনুভৱসমূহ অধ্যয়ন কৰি তাৰ লগত যিটো জড়িত অধ্যয়ন আমাৰ অনুভৱ থাকিব, সেইটোকে অধ্যয়ন কৰা হয়। চিত্ৰশিল্পৰ মূল্যৱান কেৱল ইয়াৰ উদ্দেশ্যৰ ওপৰত নিৰ্ভৰ কৰে। অকল উদ্দেশ্যই যে তাৰ মূল্যায়ন কৰিব বা ভেলু দিব, সেইটো তাক নিৰ্ধাৰণ নকৰে। আমি বহুত সময়ত দেখিবলৈ পাওঁ যে শিল্প এক অচিনাক্ত আৰু অকল্পিত মানসিক বা সাংস্কৃতিক কাৰ্য সম্পাদন কৰে। শিল্পই কি কৰে? অচিনাক্ত আৰু অকল্পিত মানসিক বা সাংস্কৃতিক কাৰ্য সম্পাদন কৰে। নিশ্চিতভাৱে শিল্প এটা এনেকুৱা বস্তু, যিটোৰ যোগেদি চিত্ৰ এটা এনেকুৱা বস্তু এতিয়া আমি কল্পনা নকৰোঁ, কেতিয়াবা আমি এই মানসিকভাৱে বা সাংস্কৃতিকভাৱে আমি তাক বেলেগ ধৰণে এটা ৰূপ দিবলৈ আমি যত্ন কৰোঁ। সেয়ে এটা মহৎ শিল্পকৃতি বহু সময়ৰ পাৰ হ'লেও মূল্যৱান হৈ থাকে। অৰ্থাৎ যি সময়ত যেনেধৰণে শিল্পটো সৃষ্টি কৰা হৈছিল, যি পেইণ্টিংটো সৃষ্টি কৰা হৈছিল, সেই সময়ত ই মূল্যৱান হ'ব পাৰে, কিন্তু সেই সময়ত তাৰ কৃতকাৰ্যতাৰ উদ্দেশ্য স্পষ্ট নাছিল। সৃষ্টিকৰ্তাই তেনেধৰণে কোনো উদ্দেশ্য আগত ৰাখি পেলাই কৰা নাছিল, কিন্তু সময়ৰ হাতত শিল্পই এটা মহৎ শিল্পকৃতি আৰু বহু সময় পাৰ হ'লেও তাৰ মূল্যৱান হৈ থাকে। অৰ্থাৎ তাৰ সৃজনশীলতা, সৃষ্টি বা তাৰ যিটো যিটো পেইণ্টিং বুলি কৈছোঁ আমি, যিটো কাম কৰা হয়, সেইটো এনেধৰণৰ এটা সৃষ্টি হয় যিটো নেকি ভূত ভৱিষ্যতৰো তাৰ সি মূল্যৱান হৈ থাকে। কিন্তু সৃষ্টিকৰ্তাই সেই সময়ত হয়তো কেতিয়াবা তাক তেনেকৈ ভবা নাই বা তেনেধৰণে কৰাও নাছিল। শিল্পৰ ব্যাখ্যা কৰাৰ প্ৰচেষ্টা চলি থাকিব বা চলি থাকে, কিন্তু তাৰ সকলো দিশ আমি ব্যাখ্যা কৰিব নোৱাৰোঁ। আমাৰ সীমাবদ্ধতা আছে, সময়ৰ কথা আছে। আমি সকলোবিলাক দিশ আমি ইয়াতে বিতংভাৱে আমি আলোচনা কৰিবলৈ সক্ষম নহ'ম। তাৰপিছত দেখিম আমি যে ভাৰতীয় আৰু ইউৰোপীয় সৌন্দৰ্যবোধ, যে ভাৰতত আৰু ইউৰোপত তাৰ এস্থেটিক ভিউটো বা চেঞ্চিবিলিটিটো কেনেধৰণৰ আছে। তো ভাৰতীয় চিত্ৰশিল্পত সৌন্দৰ্যিক মূল্যবোধ এক বিশেষ বৈশিষ্ট্য আছে, আৰু পূৰ্বৰ চিত্ৰশিল্পত প্ৰতীকবোধ অধিক সাধাৰণ আৰু কবিতাময়। আমাৰ ফালৰ কথা কোৱা হৈছে যে তাত আমাৰ চিত্ৰশিল্পত প্ৰতীকবোধ থাকে আৰু অধিক সাধাৰণ আৰু অতি সাধাৰণভাৱে তাক অংকন কৰা হয়, আৰু তাত এটা কবিতাময়, এটা কবিতাৰ যেন এটা গুণ আছে তেনেধৰণে হয়। কিন্তু পশ্চিমীয়াত ই অধিক বৌদ্ধিক আৰু স্পষ্ট। ইয়াত স্কিল, ইয়াত বৌদ্ধিক ইণ্টেলিজেঞ্চ আৰু ডিষ্টিংক্ট, এইটো এটা সাংঘাতিক পাৰ্থক্য আছে পূৰ্বৰ চিত্ৰত আৰু পশ্চিমীয়া চিত্ৰত বা পশ্চিমীয়া শিল্পত। ভাৰতীয় শিল্পত মূলতঃ সাপ, কলপাত বা গছৰ পাত, লতা, তৃণ, তৰু বা লতাজাতীয় বস্তু বগাই যোৱা, পানী আদি জড়িত ছবি লৈ পেলাই তাত মনোভাৱ প্ৰকাশ কৰিবলৈ ব্যৱহাৰ কৰা হয়। তাত দেখিবলৈ পাইছে কৃষ্ণৰ লীলা, কৃষ্ণৰ নীলা যিটো চামৰা বা কালিৰ 4টা হাত, তাক এটা প্ৰতীক হিচাপে লোৱা হৈছে, আৰু সেই বৈশিষ্ট্য, সেই চৰিত্ৰ লৈ পেলাই চিত্ৰায়ন কৰা হৈছে। কিন্তু পশ্চিমীয়াত আমি দেখিবলৈ শিল্পত প্ৰতীক আৰু ৰঙৰ ব্যৱহাৰ অধিক স্পষ্ট। তাত প্ৰতীক থাকিব, তাত ৰং থাকিব, ধৰ্মীয় আৰু সাহিত্যিক উদ্দেশ্যত ব্যৱহাৰ কৰা হয়। ঠিক তেনেকৈ প্ৰাচীন খ্ৰীষ্টান গীৰ্জাৰ আইকনোগ্ৰাফিত জটিল প্ৰতীক ব্যৱস্থাৰ বিকাশ ঘটিছিল। তাৰপিছত আমি চাম ভাৰতীয় চিত্ৰশিল্প, ইণ্ডিয়ান, আমি চাব চাওঁ যে ইণ্ডিয়ান পেইণ্টিং, ভাৰতীয় চিত্ৰশিল্প। তো ধৰ্মীয় আৰু দাৰ্শনিক চিন্তাই ভাৰতীয় চিত্ৰশিল্প গঠনত গুৰুত্বপূৰ্ণ ভূমিকা লৈছে। নিশ্চিতভাৱে ধৰ্ম ভাৰতত ভিন্ন ধৰ্ম ভিন্ন জাতিৰ লোকে বাস কৰে। তো এই ভাৰতত যিহেতু বিভিন্ন ধৰ্ম বিভিন্ন জাতিৰ লোকে বাস কৰে, গতিকে তেওঁলোকৰ চিন্তা, তেওঁলোকৰ চৰ্চা, তেওঁলোকৰ পৰিৱেশ ভিন্নতা হয়। আৰু এই ভিন্নতাৰ জৰিয়তে তাত যিটো ধৰ্মীয় আৰু দাৰ্শনিক চিন্তা, এটা দৰ্শন থাকিব, এটা ফিলচফি থাকিব, বা ভাৰতীয় চিত্ৰশিল্প গঠনত সম্পূৰ্ণ ভূমিকা গ্ৰহণ কৰিছে। তাৰ ভিতৰত ব্ৰাহ্মণ্যবাদ, বৌদ্ধ ধৰ্ম, জৈন ধৰ্ম আৰু এইকেইটা ধৰ্মত শিল্পক প্ৰভাৱিত কৰিছে। শিল্পক এইকেইটা ধৰ্মই, ব্ৰাহ্মণবাদে বিভিন্ন দেৱ দেৱতা বা বিভিন্ন ধৰণৰ পূজা অৰ্চনা কৰে, গতিকে সেইবিলাকক তেওঁলোকে প্ৰভাৱিত কৰিছিল। বৌদ্ধ ধৰ্মৰ বুদ্ধৰ চিন্তা চৰ্চা, তেওঁৰ দৰ্শন তেওঁক প্ৰতিফলিত কৰাইছিল। ঠিক তেনেকৈ জৈন ধৰ্মতো তেনেধৰণে জৈনৰ সকলৰ ধৰ্মৰ বিষয়ে তাৰ শিল্পক প্ৰভাৱিত কৰিছিল। কাৰণ প্ৰত্যেকৰ দেশত নিজৰ দৰ্শন আৰু তেওঁৰ ধৰ্ম লৈ পেলাই কাম কৰে। ইছলামত যদি চাব যাওঁ, ইছলামে ইছলামৰ দিশত কাম কৰিব, হিন্দু ধৰ্মই হিন্দু ধৰ্মৰ দিশত কাম কৰিব, বৌদ্ধ ধৰ্মই বৌদ্ধ ধৰ্মৰ দিশত কাম কৰিব, জৈন ধৰ্মই জৈনৰ কথা কৰিব, শিখসকলে শিখসকলৰ কিতাপ কৰিব, খ্ৰীষ্টানসকলে খ্ৰীষ্টান ধৰ্মত তেওঁলোকে যীশুৰ লগত জড়িত বা তেওঁলোকৰ খ্ৰীষ্টানিটিৰ লগত জড়িত তেওঁলোকৰ বিশ্বাস, পৰম্পৰা বা ধৰ্ম তাত দৰ্শন সোমাইছে, সেই লৈ তেওঁলোকে কাম কৰিব। আৰু বহু ধৰ্মৰ প্ৰাথমিকভাৱে এনিমিজিম, যাদু আৰু বহু দেৱতা বিশ্বাসৰ সময়ত পাৰ কৰি একেশ্বৰবাদ আৰু বিশ্বেশ্বৰবাদলৈ আগবাঢ়িছে। তো এনেধৰণৰ চিত্ৰৰ যোগেদি এনেধৰণে তাক প্ৰকাশ কৰা হয় যে বহু ধৰ্মত আমি দেখিম এনিমিজিম দেখিম, তাত নতুনত্ব আমি দেখিবলৈ পাম। আমি যাদুৰ কথা আহিছে আৰু বহু দেৱতা বিশ্বাসৰ সময়ৰ পৰা, অৰ্থাৎ এটা সময়ত যাদু আছিল, এটা সময়ত বহু দেৱতা বিশ্বাসৰ কথা আছিল, তাৰ পৰা আহি একেশ্বৰবাদ অৰ্থাৎ এটা ভগৱান আৰু বিশ্বেশ্বৰবাদ, বিশ্বৰ যিটো ভগৱান, সেই দিশলৈ আমাৰ চিত্ৰ ব্যৱস্থাই আগবাঢ়িছে। ভাৰতীয় চিত্ৰশিল্পত ধাৰ্মিক মিথ আৰু দ্বন্দ্ব কথা যেনে আমি দেখিবলৈ পাওঁ কৃষ্ণ আৰু গোপীসকলৰ কাহিনী। কৃষ্ণ আৰু গোপীসকলে বিভিন্ন ধৰণে তেওঁলোকে লীলা খেলা কৰিছিল, সেইবিলাক আমাৰ চিত্ৰত প্ৰতিফলিত হয়। কৃষ্ণক লৈ বিভিন্ন ধৰণৰ চিত্ৰাংকন হৈছে, বিভিন্ন ধৰণৰ পৰিৱেশ সৃষ্টি কৰা হৈছে, ৰূপ দিয়া হৈছে ভাৰতৰ বিভিন্ন দেৱ দেৱতাৰ চিত্ৰৰ যোগেদি। কাৰণ দেৱ দেৱতাবিলাককতো কোনো দেখা নাই, দেৱ দেৱতা এটা পৌৰাণিক এটা ভিত্তিৰ ওপৰত ভিত্তি কৰি পেলাই তাক প্ৰচলিত হৈ আছে, তাক এটা ৰূপ দিয়া হৈছে। শিৱ মানে এনেধৰণৰ, কৃষ্ণ মানে এনেধৰণৰ, কাৰণ তাত লিখিত কিছুমান বিৱৰণৰ পৰা তেওঁৰ আকৃতি সৃষ্টি কৰা হৈছে। যেনেকৈ চিত্ৰৰ পৰা তেওঁক বুজা যায় যে তেওঁৰ ত্ৰিশূল থাকিব, তেওঁৰ সৰ্প থাকিব, চুলিত ফিতা থাকিব, বা এটা বেলেগ ৰূপত থাকিব, যেনেকৈ দুৰ্গাৰ ৰূপ থাকিব। গতিকে এইবিলাক যিবিলাক বিৱৰণ, এইবিলাক বিৱৰণো পৰাও চিত্ৰ হ'ব পাৰে, চিত্ৰৰ পৰাও বিৱৰণ হ'ব পাৰে। চিত্ৰটো ভাষা থাকে, ভাষাটো চিত্ৰ থাকে, ভাষাটোৰ পৰা আমি এটা চিত্ৰ বিচাৰি পাব পাৰোঁ যে ইমানখন হাত, ইমানটা মূৰ, তো ইমান চেহেৰাৰ, এনেধৰণে আমি তাত যদি বিৱৰণ পাওঁ তেনেধৰণে আমি চিত্ৰায়িত কৰিব পাৰোঁ, চিত্ৰৰ ৰূপত আমি দেখিবলৈ পাব পাৰোঁ। ঠিক তেনেকৈ কৃষ্ণৰ কথা আমি দেখিবলৈ পাইছোঁ, গোপীসকলৰ কথা আমি দেখিবলৈ পাইছোঁ। তাৰপিছতে অপ্ৰাকৃতিক ভিত্তিক বিষয়বস্তু আমি যদি চাব যাওঁ, যেনে শিৱদেৱৰ বহুবিধ হাত প্ৰজীৱিত কৰাৰ প্ৰতি শিল্পী, ৰজা আৰু জনসাধাৰণৰ স্ফূৰ্তি আমি দেখিবলৈ পাওঁ ভাৰতীয় চিত্ৰশিল্পত আমি যদি চাবলৈ যাওঁ। তাৰপিছতে আমি ইয়াত আমি আকৌ ভাৰতীয় কণ্টেক্সটত আমি চাব লাগিব, ভাৰতীয় চিত্ৰশিল্পৰ পৰিৱেশ ক্ষেত্ৰত আমি চাব লাগিব। আমি দেখিবলৈ পাম যে গ্ৰীক আৰু ভাৰতীয় সংস্কৃতিত শিল্পৰ আৰম্ভণি সাধন আৰু ধৰ্মীয় উদ্দেশ্যত হৈছিল। অৰ্থাৎ গ্ৰীকসকলেও তেওঁলোকৰ ধৰ্মীয় চিন্তা লৈ পেলাই বা ভাৰতীয়সকলেও তেওঁলোকৰ সংস্কৃতি শিল্পৰ যিটো সাধনা আৰম্ভণি তাত ধৰ্মীয় উদ্দেশ্য আগত লৈয়ে আগবাঢ়িছে। তাৰপিছতে আমি দেখিবলৈ পাম দাৰ্শনিক আলোচনাই পাছত শিল্পৰ লক্ষ্য আৰু মূল্যায়নৰ বিষয়ে ব্যাখ্যা কৰিছে। পৰৱৰ্তী সময়ত দৰ্শন যেতিয়া তাৰ লগত সংলগ্ন হ'ল, তাৰপিছত শিল্পৰ লক্ষ্য কি, ইয়াৰ মূল্যবোধ কি, ইয়াৰ মূল্যায়ন কেনেধৰণে কৰা যায়, সেইবিলাক পৰৱৰ্তী সময়ত এই দিশত আগবাঢ়িছে। আমি যদিও সকলো ভাৰতীয় শিল্প ধৰ্মীয় উদ্দেশ্যত সৃষ্টি হোৱা নহয়, তথাপি অধিকাংশ শিল্পক ধৰ্মীয় দৃষ্টিকোণৰ পৰা ব্যাখ্যা কৰিব লাগে। ক'ৰবাত কেতিয়াবা কোৱা হয় যে সকলো ভাৰতীয় শিল্প ধৰ্মীয় উদ্দেশ্যত সৃষ্টি হোৱা নাই, ধৰ্মীয় উদ্দেশ্য আগত ৰাখি শিল্প সৃষ্টি হোৱা নাই, বহুতকেইটা যদিও হৈছে, কিন্তু তাৰপিছতো অধিকাংশ শিল্পক ধৰ্মীয় দৃষ্টিকোণৰ পৰা ব্যাখ্যা কৰিব আমি পাৰোঁ। ধৰ্মীয় পাৰ্চপেক্টিভত আমি বা কনটেক্সটত আমি আলোচনা কৰিব পাৰোঁ। ভাৰতীয় শিল্পত ইন্দ্ৰিয়গত অনুভৱৰ ওপৰত যদিও সন্দেহ আছে, তথাপিতো শিল্পীসকলে ইন্দ্ৰিয় উপকৰণ ব্যৱহাৰৰ অব্যাহত ৰাখিছে। তেওঁলোকে কিন্তু অব্যাহত ৰাখিছে। ভাৰতীয় শিল্পত মিষ্টিক প্ৰতিবোধ গুৰুত্বপূৰ্ণ, যেনে নৃত্য কৰা, শিৱৰ ৰূপ সৃষ্টি আৰু বিনাশ চন্দ্ৰ প্ৰকাশ। অৰ্থাৎ চিম্বল হিচাপে শিৱই যে নৃত্য কৰিছে, শিৱই যে বিনাশ কৰিছে, তাৰ বিভিন্ন ৰূপ বিভিন্ন চিত্ৰৰ জৰিয়তে তাক প্ৰকাশ কৰা হৈছে, চিত্ৰায়িত কৰা হৈছে, তাক দেখিবলৈ যত্ন কৰা হৈছে। ৰস তত্ত্ব থিয়ৰী অফ ৰসৰ। তো আমি এটা চাৰ্ট, যিটো সৌন্দৰ্য এটা চাৰ্ট, আমি এটা টেষ্ট, আমি এটা তৃপ্তি লাভ কৰোঁ। আমি এখন চিত্ৰ বা এখন ছবি আমি দেখাৰ পিছত আমি তাৰ এটা সৌন্দৰ্যবোধ আমি উপলব্ধ কৰোঁ, আৰু তাৰ পৰা আমি এটা তৃপ্তি সন্তুষ্টি আমি উপলব্ধি কৰোঁ। আমি তাৰ পৰা এটা কিবা বিচাৰি পাওঁ, আমি তাত কিবা পাবলৈ সক্ষম হওঁ। তো কথা হ'ল ভাৰতীয় শিল্পত ৰস তত্ত্ব অতি গুৰুত্বপূৰ্ণ। আমি যদি চাব যাওঁ ভাৰতীয় শিল্পত ৰস তত্ত্ব অতি গুৰুত্বপূৰ্ণ আৰু অতি ৰস থকা এটা শিল্প, য'ত ভৰতমুনি আমি কথা ক'ব পাৰোঁ। ভৰতমুনি এজন মিথিকেল চেজ প্ৰিষ্ট আছিল, আৰু তেওঁ বিভিন্ন দিশত এই বিষয়ে তেওঁ থিয়ৰী ডেভেলপ কৰিছিল। আৰু ভৰতমুনিয়ে AD 500 চনত, আৰু তাৰপিছত তেওঁ ৰস তত্ত্ব অধ্যয়ন কৰিছিল প্ৰথম, আৰু তাৰপিছত অভিনৱ গুপ্তই 1000 খ্ৰীষ্টাব্দত তাৰ উন্নতি ঘটাইছিল, আৰু তেওঁ তাত ব্যৱহাৰ কৰিছিল যে তেওঁ বিভিন্ন তাৰ প্ৰকাৰ, তাৰ কৌশল, তাৰ ভেৰাইটি, তাৰ পয়েট্ৰি, তাৰ ভিজুৱেল আৰ্ট তেওঁ দেখাবলৈ তেওঁ যত্ন কৰিছিল। ভৰতমুনিৰ মতে মূল অনুভৱসমূহ আছিল আনন্দ, য'ত ফূৰ্তি, য'ত হাঁহি, য'ত বিষাদ, য'ত আনন্দ থাকিব তাত স্বৰো থাকিব, য'ত লাগ-তাগ থাকিব তাত আমি দেখিম যে বিষাদো থাকিব, য'ত ক্ৰোধ তাত ক্ৰোধো জড়িত হৈ থাকিব, তাৰপিছতে তাত বীৰত্ব থাকিব, তাৰপিছত তাত ভয় থাকিব, তাৰপিছত বিমুখতা আৰু আচৰিততা। অৰ্থাৎ তাত আমি দেখিবলৈ পাম যে বিভিন্ন ধৰণৰ ডিছগাষ্ট হওক বা এষ্টনিছমেণ্ট আমি দেখিবলৈ পাম। অৰ্থাৎ আমি ভৰতমুনি ক'ব বিচাৰিছে তেওঁৰ ৰসতত্ত্বৰ যোগেদি যে মূল অনুভৱসমূহ হৈছে আমাৰ চিত্ৰৰ যোগেদি আমি কেনেকৈ অনুভৱ আমি প্ৰকাশ কৰোঁ। আমাৰ আনন্দ হ'লে তাত আমাৰ যেনেকৈ মুখত হাঁহি আহিব, ফূৰ্তি আহিব, উল্লাস আহিব, ঠিক তেনেকৈ ছবি এখনতো এনেধৰণে আনন্দ প্ৰতিফলিত হয়, তাত প্ৰতিফলিত হয়। ছবি যদি আমি দুখন ছবি দিওঁ, এখন যদি আনন্দ থাকে, এখনত যদি বিষাদ থাকে, আমি দেখিলে গম পাম যে এইখন ছবিত আনন্দ আছে, ইয়াত জয় আছে, এইখন আনন্দত বিষাদ আছে, অৰ্থাৎ ইয়াত স্বৰো আছে, কিবা নাই কিবা এটা ব্যতিক্ৰম আমি দেখিবলৈ পাম। হাঁহি আমি দেখিবলৈ পাম, ক্ৰোধ ত্বৰান্বিত হোৱা এটা আমি চিত্ৰত আমি দেখিলেই গম পাম যে ক্ৰোধ শিৱৰ ৰুদ্ৰমূৰ্তিত আমি যিটো ত্বৰান্বিত হৈছিল, সেই ক্ৰোধ আমি তাত দেখিবলৈ পাম। ক'ৰবাত বীৰত্ব কথা প্ৰতিফলিত কৰিব বিচৰা হৈছে, তো সেইটো আমি দেখিবলৈ পাম। গতিকে ভৰতমুনিয়ে এই ৰসৰ সৃষ্টি কৰিছিল। প্ৰথম তেওঁৰ ৰসতত্ত্ব উদ্ঘাটন কৰিছিল আৰু তাৰপিছত পিছৰ পৰ্যায়ত তেওঁ কণ্টিনিউ কৰিছিল বা তাৰ উন্নতি সাধন কৰিছিল অভিনৱ গুপ্তা 1000 খ্ৰীষ্টাব্দত, আৰু তেওঁ বিভিন্ন ধৰণৰ উন্নতি কৰিছিল। আৰু ভৰতমুনিয়ে তেওঁ এটা মতামত আগবঢ়াইছিল এই ক্ষেত্ৰত যে আনন্দ, হাঁহি, বিষাদ, ক্ৰোধ, বীৰত্ব, ভয় বা ফিয়াৰ বা বিমুখতা, য'ত আমি কেতিয়াবা বিফল হওঁ, আমি ছাকচেছ নহওঁ, সফল হ'ব নাপাওঁ, তো তাৰ প্ৰতিচ্ছবি প্ৰতিফলিত হৈছিল। আৰু কেতিয়াবা ক্ষেত্ৰত আমি বিভিন্ন ধৰণৰ আচহুৱা বা আচৰিত আমি তেনেধৰণৰ আমি অনুভৱ বা চিত্ৰৰ যোগেদি চিত্ৰাংকন কৰা হৈছিল। আৰু তেওঁ মূলতঃ ভৰতমুনিয়ে এনেধৰণৰ অনুভৱসমূহ ব্যক্ত কৰিব বিচাৰিছে তেওঁৰ ৰসতত্ত্বৰ জৰিয়তে, য'ত নেকি সৌন্দৰ্য বা সাধন কথা জড়িত হৈ আছে। তো এইবোৰক শিল্পৰ জৰিয়তে ৰসৰ ৰূপান্তৰ কৰা হয়। শিল্পৰ যোগেদি তাত ৰসৰ ৰূপান্তৰ কৰা হয়। শিল্প এটা আৰ্ট, এটা কলা, তাৰ যোগেদি ৰূপান্তৰ কৰা হয়। আৰু তাৰপিছতে আমি দেখিবলৈ পাম য'ত নেকি আমি তাত বিভিন্ন ধৰণৰ আমি কোৱালিটিজ দেখিবলৈ পাম। তাত আমাৰ ফিলিংছবিলাক আহিব, সেইবিলাক আমি তাত বিশ্লেষণ কৰিবলৈ আমি সক্ষম হ'ম। আৰু সেইবিলাকেই আমাৰ এটা এস্থেটিক আমাক ভিউ দিব। ই ট্ৰান্সফৰ্ম কৰিব ৰসে, য'ত এৰটিক, কমিক, পেথেটিক, ফিউৰিয়াছ, ফেৰিবল, অডিয়াছ, মাৰ্ভেলাছ আৰু কাম, অৰ্থাৎ শৃংগাৰ, হাস্য। তাৰপিছত আমি দেখিবলৈ পাম কৰুণ, ৰৌদ্ৰ, ভয়ানক, বিমৰ্গতা, অদ্ভুত আৰু শান্ত। তাত ৰসৰ জৰিয়তে তাক ৰূপান্তৰ কৰিবলৈ যত্ন কৰা হয় এইবিলাক কথাত। তাৰপিছত আমি দেখিবলৈ পাম যে ভাৰতীয় চিত্ৰত কোৱা হৈছে যে যৌনতা প্ৰাকৃতিক আৰু ধৰ্মীয় ছন্দৰ অংশ বুলি গণ্য কৰা হৈছে। আৰু পশ্চিমীয়া দৃষ্টিভংগীতকৈ ভাৰতীয় এটা ফিলিংছ বা তাৰ বিউটি, সেইটো পৃথক বুলি কোৱা হৈছে, ভিন্ন বুলি কোৱা হৈছে। তাক বেলেগ ধৰণে, বেলেগ দৃষ্টিৰে চোৱা হৈছে। তাৰপিছত দেখিম আমি সাধাৰণ বৈশিষ্ট্যসমূহ, জেনেৰেল কেৰেক্টাৰিষ্টিক্স। আমি সাধাৰণ বৈশিষ্ট্যসমূহ, আমি কিহৰ সাধাৰণ বৈশিষ্ট্য, পেইণ্টিঙৰ সাধাৰণ বৈশিষ্ট্যসমূহ আমি চাবলৈ যত্ন কৰিম, যাতে তাত ভাসমান চিত্ৰ। এক চিত্ৰক মূলতঃ আমি ইয়াৰ চৰিত্ৰৰ ভিতৰত দেখিছোঁ যে তাত তিনিটা মূল আমি ভাগত দেখিবলৈ পাইছোঁ যে প্ৰথমটো হৈছে যিটো আমি দেখিবলৈ পাইছোঁ যে চিত্ৰ এটা সম্পূৰ্ণ আকাৰ, এটা কমপ্লিট তাৰ এটা আকাৰ, শ্বেপ, চাইজ, কালাৰ বা তাৰ কনটেক্সট দিয়া হৈছে অৰ্থচিত্ৰ, অৰ্থাৎ উচ্চ নিবৃত্ত আকাৰ অৰ্থচিত্ৰ। তাৰপিছতে আমি দেখিবলৈ পাম যে চিত্ৰাভাস, এটা চিত্ৰৰ এটা জাষ্ট এটা তাৰ এটা বিৱৰণ দিয়া হৈছে। আৰু এইবিলাক আমি শব্দবোৰ ইয়াত গভীৰতাতে সূচাই, গভীৰতা তাক বুজোৱা যায়, তাক দেখিবলৈ পোৱা যায়। তাৰপিছতে আমি দেখিম যে ইয়াতে আৰু এটা বিশেষ আমি এটা উদাহৰণ দেখিবলৈ পাম, আৰু সেইটো হৈছে যে চৰংগ অনুযায়ী আমি যদি চাওঁ ৰূপ ভেদ, প্ৰমাণ, ভাৱযোগ, লাৱণ্য যোগ, সাদৃশ্য আৰু বাৰ্ণিক ভংগ। তো বিভিন্ন ৰূপত বিভিন্ন সময়ত আমি বেলেগ বেলেগকৈ আমাৰ চিত্ৰক আমি দেখিবলৈ পাম, আমি তাক প্ৰতিফলিত হোৱা আমি দেখিবলৈ পাম। আৰু ইয়াতে তাত 6 limbs of painting বুলি কোৱা হয়, 6 limbs of painting অৰ্থাৎ চৰংগ, আৰু ইয়াতে কি কোৱা হৈছে ইয়াত কামসূত্ৰৰ কথা কোৱা হৈছে, ইয়াত ইম্পৰ্টেণ্ট লিম্বৰ কথা কোৱা হৈছে, বিভিন্ন ধৰণৰ ইয়াতে ৰূপৰেখাৰ কথা কোৱা হৈছে, ইয়াতে প্ৰপোৰ্চনৰ কথা কোৱা হৈছে, ইয়াতে তাৰপিছত আমি দেখিবলৈ পাম ইয়াতে প্ৰমাণৰ কথা কোৱা হৈছে। তাৰপিছতে আমি দেখিব পাৰোঁ যে ইয়াতে আমি ভাৱযোগৰ কথা কোৱা হৈছে, যোজনা বা ক্ৰিয়েশ্যন অফ লাষ্টাৰ এণ্ড বিট এচেঞ্চৰ কথা কৈছে, য'ত লাৱণ্য যোগৰ কথা কোৱা হৈছে। তাৰপিছতে পৰ্ট্ৰেল অফ লাইকনেছ কথা কোৱা হৈছে, য'ত নেকি সাদৃশ্য, কালাৰ মিক্সিং টু প্ৰডিউচ দ্য ইফেক্ট অফ মডেলিং অৰ্থাৎ বৰ্ণিকা ভংগ, বিভিন্ন ধৰণৰ তাৰ ভংগী বা আকাৰৰ কথা কোৱা হৈছে। অৰ্থাৎ ছটা পেইণ্টিঙৰ লিম্ছৰ কথা কোৱা হৈছে। তাৰপিছত আমি দেখিম যিটো আমি এতিয়া উদাহৰণ হিচাপে আমি চাবলৈ যাওঁ, তো ইয়াতে অজন্তাৰ নালাগিৰি দমন, তাৰপিছতে এটা ভয়ানক ৰস আৰু শান্তৰস, দুয়োটা অপূৰ্ব অভিব্যক্তি তাত প্ৰকাশ কৰা হৈছে। তাৰ যোগেদি ঋতুবোৰ আৰু প্ৰাকৃতিক ভাৱনাৰ সূচনাৰে চিত্ৰশিল্পত গভীৰ অৰ্থত তাক সৃষ্টি কৰা হৈছে। তো আমি দেখিবলৈ পালোঁ যে চিত্ৰশিল্পত বিভিন্ন ধৰণৰ বিভিন্ন দিশ, তাত ইমোশ্যনৰ কথা জড়িত হৈছে, বিভিন্ন ধৰণৰ ছবিত তাক ব্যাখ্যা কৰা হৈছে, তাত ইমোশ্যন, তাৰ আৱেগ তাত প্ৰতিফলিত হৈছে, তাত বুদ্ধৰ কথা কোৱা হৈছে, তাত বিভিন্ন ধৰণৰ দিশত আৰু তাত বিভিন্ন মেথড বা পদ্ধতি ছাজেষ্ট কৰা হৈছে, বিভিন্ন দিশত তাৰ চৰিত্ৰ আৰু তাক কেনেধৰণে গণনা কৰা হৈছে, তাক ৰূপ দিয়া হৈছে। আমি যদি চাব যাওঁ বিভিন্ন ধৰণৰ আমি দেখিবলৈ পাম, বিভিন্ন ধৰণে তাক ৰূপায়িত কৰা আমি দেখিবলৈ পাম। এতিয়া কথা হ'ল আমাৰ আন এটা দিশ আমি আলোচনা কৰিবলৈ যাম, আৰু সেইটো হৈছে আমাৰ স্থানিক বিস্তাৰ বুলি কোৱাৰ লগে লগে স্পেচিয়েল ডিষ্ট্ৰিবিউশ্যনৰ কথা আহিব। স্থান, কাল, পাত্ৰ ভেদে আমি বেলেগ বেলেগ অভিডেন্স, আমি প্ৰমাণ পাবলৈ সক্ষম হৈছোঁ। আৰু পেইণ্টিং আৰু বিভিন্ন ধৰণে আৰ্ট ভাৰতীয় পৌৰাণিক কালত প্ৰাচীন ভাৰতত চিত্ৰশিল্প উন্নত আছিল, আমি এইটো আটাই জানো। তাত এটা উন্নত ৰূপত আমি দেখিবলৈ পাইছোঁ, আৰু যিবিলাক পাইছোঁ আমি লিটাৰেৰী এভিডেন্সৰ পৰাই পাইছোঁ, আৰু সেইবিলাকে প্ৰুভ কৰিছে যে ভাৰতীয় আৰ্ট পেইণ্টিং এটা পৌৰাণিক কালৰ পৰাই ই এটা উন্নত ৰূপত আছিল, আৰু বৰ্তমানো আছে, আৰু বিভিন্ন প্লেচত, বিভিন্ন ঠাইত ইয়াক বিভিন্ন ধৰণে আমি ৰূপায়িত কৰা দেখিবলৈ পাইছোঁ। তো ৰাজপ্ৰসাদ আৰু ধনৱান ব্যক্তিৰ ঘৰবোৰত মনোৰম ভীতিচিত্ৰ আৰু সৰুচিত্ৰ আছে। অৰ্থাৎ যিবিলাক ৰাজদৰবাৰ আছিল, ৰজাৰ দৰবাৰ আছিল, য'ত বিভিন্ন ধৰণৰ তাক এডন কৰা হৈছিল, বিউটিফাই কৰা হৈছিল মুৰেল আৰু স্মল পেইণ্টিঙৰ যোগেদি, আৰু সেইবিলাক তাত বিভিন্ন বৰ্ডত তাক প্ৰিপেয়াৰ কৰা হৈছিল, আৰু সেইবিলাক প্ৰসাদত ঘৰবোৰত মনোৰমভাৱে তাক দেখিবলৈ পোৱা হৈছিল বা তাত ৰখা হৈছিল। তাৰপিছত আমি দেখিবলৈ পাম যে শিক্ষা যিবিলাক লাভ কৰিছিল বহুত মহিলা, বহুত পুৰুষ, কাৰণ শিক্ষা ভাৰতীয় পেইণ্টিঙৰ উন্নতিৰ কাৰণে বিভিন্ন ধৰণে যত্ন কৰা হৈছিল, আৰু তাৰ ফলত বিভিন্ন লোকে শিক্ষিত এডুকেটেড হৈছিল, এটা গ্ৰুপে এডুকেটেড হৈছিল। সেইবিলাক পুৰুষেই হওক বা মহিলাই হওক, তেওঁলোকে শিক্ষিত হৈ পেলাই তেওঁলোকে নিজেই নিজৰ ব্ৰাছ হাতত লৈ নিজে যত্ন কৰিছিল যে তুলিকা ব্যৱহাৰ কৰি দক্ষতাৰে স্কিলফুলি তেওঁলোকে ব্যৱহাৰ কৰিছিল। যেতিয়া শিক্ষা লাভ কৰা বহুত পুৰুষ আৰু মহিলাই দক্ষভাৱে তুলিকা ব্যৱহাৰ কৰিব পাৰিছিল, তেওঁলোকে খুব স্কিলফুলি কৰিব পাৰিছিল, আৰু বিভিন্ন চিত্ৰ তেওঁলোকে চিত্ৰায়িত কৰিছিল, তেওঁলোকে চিত্ৰ অংকন কৰিছিল, তাৰ যোগেদি বিভিন্ন মেছেজ দিবলৈ তেওঁলোকে সক্ষম হৈছিল। যদিও সেইবিলাক এতিয়া আজিৰ দিনত আমাৰ যি ৰিমেইন হিচাপে আছে এনচিয়েণ্ট ইণ্ডিয়ান পেইণ্টিংছ, সেইবিলাক আমি তাক এটা বেয়া ৰূপত আমি দেখিবলৈ পাইছোঁ, কাৰণ তাক যিভাৱে ৰাখিব লাগিছিল সেইভাৱে তাক ৰখা হোৱা নাই, আৰু বৰ্তমানলৈকে বহু প্ৰাচীন ভীতিচিত্ৰ নষ্ট হৈ পৰিছে। কিন্তু কেইটামান গুহা মন্দিৰৰ ভীতিচিত্ৰ প্ৰাচীন ভাৰতীয় চিত্ৰশিল্পৰ কৃতিত্ব প্ৰমাণ কৰে। অৰ্থাৎ যিবিলাক এতিয়াও আছে সেইবিলাকেই আমাক এতিয়াও এইটোৱে মেছেজ দিব খোজে যে প্ৰাচীন ভাৰতত কেনেধৰণে চিত্ৰৰ চৰ্চা কৰা হৈছিল, চিত্ৰ অংকন কৰা হৈছিল, তাৰ যোগেদি কেনেধৰণে মেছেজ দিবলৈ সক্ষম হৈছিল। অৰ্থাৎ এটা চিত্ৰৰ পৰা আমি বহুত কথা আমি জানিব পাৰোঁ। ধৰি লোৱা হ'ল যে এটা মুদ্ৰা, আৰু এটা মুদ্ৰা প্ৰাচীন কালৰ মুদ্ৰা পোৱা গৈছে, আৰু মুদ্ৰাত আমি এখন ছবি দেখিবলৈ পাইছোঁ। তো সেই ছবিখন দেখিছোঁ মানে সেই ৰজাৰ দিনত ধৰি লৈছোঁ এটা ধৰ্মীয় চিম্বল দেখিছোঁ। সেই ৰজাৰ দিনত সেই ধৰ্ম, অৰ্থাৎ সেই ধৰ্ম সেই ৰজাৰ দিনত প্ৰচলিত আছিল, তাৰে লোকসকলে সেই ধৰ্মক বিশ্বাস কৰিছিল। অৰ্থাৎ এটা চিত্ৰ সেই সময়ত প্ৰাসংগিক আছিল বা নাছিল কথা নহয়, সেইটো বস্তু আজি উদ্ঘাটন হোৱাৰ পিছত আমি দেখিম যে তাক ষ্টাডি কৰিছে অতি পৌৰাণিক কালতো এই ধৰ্মটো সেই সময়ত প্ৰচলিত আছিল। অৰ্থাৎ এটা চিত্ৰই আমাক বহুত খবৰ দিব পাৰে, এটা মেছেজ দিব পাৰে। যেনেকৈ এটা মুদ্ৰাৰ পৰা আমি বহুত তথ্য লাভ কৰিব, তাত মেটেল ইউজ, তাত সময়, তাত ৰিচনেছ, তাত টেকন'লজি, তাত মানে কোন ৰজাৰ দিনত আছিল, বিভিন্ন তথ্য আমি লাভ কৰিবলৈ সক্ষম হওঁ। ঠিক তেনেকৈ এই গুহাৰ ভিতৰত যিবিলাক চিত্ৰায়িত কৰা হৈছিল, তাৰ পৰা সেই সময়ৰ মানুহৰ চিন্তাৰ উদ্ৰেক ঘটিছিল, প্ৰতিফলন ঘটিছিল, তেওঁলোকে কেনেধৰণে চিত্ৰৰ যোগেদি সেই সময়ৰ আমি ক'ব যদি যাওঁ ৰাজনৈতিক, অৰ্থনৈতিক, সামাজিক বা বিভিন্ন দিশত বিভিন্ন পাৰিপাৰ্শ্বিক সকলো দিশ তাত প্ৰতিফলিত হৈছিল। মানুহবিলাকে কিহৰ ওপৰত বিশ্বাস কৰিছিল, কিহৰ ওপৰত তেওঁলোকৰ ভয় আছিল, কিহক লৈ তেওঁলোকে আনন্দ কৰিছিল, সকলোবিলাক তেনেধৰণে প্ৰতিফলিত কৰিবলৈ বা পৰিস্ফুট কৰিবলৈ সক্ষম হৈছিল। তো আমি এতিয়া দেখিবলৈ পাম যে আমি প্ৰাক ঐতিহাসিক কালত, অৰ্থাৎ প্ৰি হিষ্টৰিক কালত, যদিও আমি ইমান কথা কৈ আছোঁ, আমি এতিয়া এটা চিষ্টেমেটিকেলি আমি এটা বিষয়ত আলোচনা কৰিবলৈ গৈ আছোঁ যে প্ৰাক ঐতিহাসিক চিত্ৰ, প্ৰি হিষ্টৰিক পেইণ্টিংছ। প্ৰি হিষ্টৰিক কালত প্ৰিমিটিভ যুগত মানুহবিলাকে সাধাৰণতে গুহাত পেইণ্টিংবিলাক, ভাৰতীয় পেইণ্টিংবিলাক গুহাত, প্ৰিমিটিভ যিবিলাক কেভ আছিল, পৌৰাণিক গুহা আছিল, সেই গুহাবিলাকত বা ৰকত, শিলত খোদিত কৰিছিল, আৰু তাত আমি দেখিবলৈ পাওঁ শিলৰ ওপৰত বা গুহাৰ ভিতৰত। সেইটো হৈছে প্ৰি হিষ্টৰিক, অৰ্থাৎ প্ৰাক ঐতিহাসিক এই কালত বা প্ৰাক ঐতিহাসিক চিত্ৰশিল্প। তো সেই সময়ত প্ৰাক ঐতিহাসিক ভাৰতত উদ্ভৱ চিত্ৰশিল্পৰ অৱস্থান বিষয়ে যদি চাব যাওঁ, তেতিয়াহ'লে মিৰ্জাপুৰ আৰু বান্দা, য'ত উত্তৰ প্ৰদেশ, মিৰ্জাপুৰ, বান্দা উত্তৰ প্ৰদেশত অৱস্থিত, আৰু তাত বিভিন্ন ধৰণৰ পৌৰাণিক চিত্ৰশিল্প দেখিবলৈ পোৱা যায়। বিভিন্ন ধৰণে তাত চিত্ৰ অংকিত কৰা হৈছিল। তাৰপিছত যদি আমি চাব যাওঁ, নেক্সটটো হৈছে মহাদেৱ অফ দ্য বিন্দাছ ৰেঞ্জ ইন বুন্দেলখাণ্ড, অৰ্থাৎ বুন্দেলখাণ্ডৰ মহাদেৱ পৰ্বতমালা। এই পৰ্বতমালাত বিভিন্ন ধৰণৰ চিত্ৰ, প্ৰাচীন কালত চিত্ৰ পোৱা যায়, দেখিবলৈ পোৱা যায় বা তাত চিত্ৰায়িত কৰা হৈছিল। তাৰ পৰা আমি বহুত কথা জানিব পাৰোঁ। অৰ্থাৎ প্ৰাচীন কালতে, প্ৰাগৈতিহাসিক কালতে চিত্ৰই এটা ৰূপ পাবলৈ সক্ষম হৈছিল, বিশেষত্ব লাভ কৰিবলৈ সক্ষম হৈছিল, বা চিত্ৰৰ যোগেদি বিভিন্ন ধৰণৰ সেই সময়ৰ মেছেজ দিবলৈ সক্ষম হৈছিল। অৰ্থাৎ ধৰি লোৱা হ'ল যে কিহক তেওঁলোকে পূজা কৰিছিল, যে পূজা কৰি তাত নিশ্চয় পূজা কৰা, যিহক উপাসনা কৰে তেওঁলোকে তাৰ এটা চিম্বল দেখিছিল। জীৱ জন্তু হিচাপে কিহক তেওঁলোকে উপাসনা কৰিছিল বা প্ৰাধান্য দিছিল, বা গছ গছনি তেওঁলোকৰ কোনবিলাক আছে, তো সেইবিলাক তাত চিত্ৰাংকিত কৰিছিল। সেইবিলাক সেই সময়ত প্ৰাসংগিক আছিল। গতিকে তেনেধৰণে সেইবিলাক পোৱা যায়। তাৰপিছতে লাৰিমুৰ পৰ্বত বাকেলখণ্ড, ঠিক তেনেকৈ সিঙানপুৰ, ৰায়গড় মধ্য ভাৰতৰ কথা কোৱা হৈছে, বেল্লাৰী দক্ষিণ ভাৰত। তো এই যে আমি ইয়াত এইবিলাক ঠাইৰ কথা, পেইণ্টিঙৰ কথা আমি পোৱাৰ কথা কৈছোঁ, যে প্ৰিমিটিভ কেভত বা ৰকত এইবিলাক অঞ্চলত পোৱা গৈছিল ভাৰতীয় পেইণ্টিং। আৰু এইকেইটা স্থান হৈছে মিৰ্জাপুৰ আৰু বান্দা, এইটো হৈছে উত্তৰ প্ৰদেশ, মহাদেৱ পৰ্বতমালা এইটো বুন্দেলখণ্ড, লাৰিমুৰ পৰ্বত সেইটো হ'ল বাঘেলখণ্ড, আৰু সিংহানপুৰ এইটো হ'ল ৰায়গড় মধ্য ভাৰত, আৰু আনটো হৈছে বেল্লাৰী দক্ষিণ ভাৰত। তো এই পাৰ্থক্য, এইখিনিত আমি এতিয়া মূল কথালৈকে আহিব লাগিব, মূল বিষয়টো। তো শিকাৰ দৃশ্য তাত আমি কি দেখিম, যে বনৰীয়া জন্তুৰ লগত মানুহৰ সংগ্ৰাম, যে বনৰীয়া জন্তুবিলাকে মানুহৰ আক্ৰমণ কৰিব আহে, মানুহে সংগ্ৰাম কৰিবলগীয়া হয়, বাধা দিব লগা হয়, প্ৰতিহত কৰা হয়। ক'ৰবাত হয়তো চিকাৰৰ চিত্ৰ পোৱা যাব। তাত চিকাৰ দুই ধৰণৰ কথা আছিল, এক ধৰণৰ খাবলৈ চিকাৰ কৰা হৈছিল, আন ধৰণৰ ৰক্ষা পাবলৈ, তেওঁলোকক ভয় খুৱাবৰ কাৰণে বিভিন্ন ধৰণে তেওঁলোকৰ মাজত যিটো সংগ্ৰাম সেইটো দেখুওৱা হৈছিল। তাৰপিছত সৰু সাধাৰণ ৰূপত অঁকা হৈছিল, সৰু সৰু সাধাৰণ ৰূপত সেইবিলাক চিত্ৰ অংকন কৰা হৈছিল। ৰং ৰূপৰ কথা যদি ক'ব যাওঁ, ৰঙৰ সঠিক ব্যৱহাৰ, অৰ্থাৎ সেই সময়ত ৰঙা ৰঙে তাত প্ৰাধান্য লাভ কৰিছিল। ৰঙা ৰঙটো প্ৰতি মানুহৰ আকৰ্ষণ আছিল, ৰঙা ৰঙেৰে তেওঁলোকে বুজাই দিবলৈ যত্ন কৰিছিল। অৰ্থাৎ ৰঙা ৰং অধিক তাত ব্যৱহাৰ হোৱা দেখিবলৈ পোৱা গৈছিল। তাৰপিছত আমি যদি চাবলৈ যাওঁ, ৰঙা ৰঙৰ কথা আহিছে, তাৰপিছত আমি যদি চাবলৈ যাওঁ কিছু চিত্ৰত জীৱন্ত গতি দেখুওৱা হৈছে। অৰ্থাৎ এটা চিত্ৰত এনেধৰণে চিত্ৰায়িত কৰা হৈছে যে যেন সেইটো এটা সজীৱ হৈ আছে, তাত লাইভ হৈ আছে, তাত যেন দৌৰি আছে, তেনেধৰণৰ এটা চিত্ৰ দেখুওৱা হৈছে। য'ত ভেৰি স্মল নাম্বাৰ অফ আৰু টুৰিষ্টৰ কথালৈকে আহিম পিছত। তো তাত ৰঙা ৰং অধিক কিছু চিত্ৰত জীৱন্ত গতি দেখুওৱা হৈছে। য'ত উদাহৰণ হিচাপে যদি আমি চাওঁ, সিঙানপুৰত দৌৰি অহা কুকুৰ, সিঙানপুৰত এনেকুৱা এটা চিত্ৰ দেখিবলৈ পোৱা যায় যে তাত এটা কুকুৰ যেন দৌৰি আহিছে, অৰ্থাৎ তাত জীৱন্ত গতি দেখুওৱা হৈছে। তেওঁলোকে সেইখিনিও স্থিৰ হওক বা জীৱন্ত হওক তেনেধৰণৰ ৰূপ দিবলৈ যত্ন কৰিছিল, তাৰপিছতে সক্ষম হৈছিল। তাৰপিছত যদি আমি চাবলৈ যাওঁ, ইয়াত পৰ্যটন ব্যৱস্থা উন্নয়নৰ অভাৱৰ বাবে ইয়াত পৰ্যটন সম্ভাৱনা বৰ্তমান সময়লৈকে কম। অৰ্থাৎ টুৰিষ্টবিলাকৰ আকৰ্ষণ, টুৰিষ্টবিলাকে তেওঁলোকে বিভিন্ন ধৰণে আকৰ্ষিত হয় বা মনোযোগ দিয়ে আৰু তেওঁলোকে চাবলৈ যত্ন কৰে। গতিকে যদি আমি চাব যাওঁ, তাত পৰ্যটনৰ ক্ষেত্ৰত পৰ্যটক সদায় নতুনত্ব আৰু পাশ্চাত্য আৰু পূবৰ মাজত পাৰ্থক্য আমি দেখিবলৈ পাইছোঁ পেইণ্টিঙৰ মাজতো। গতিকে তেওঁলোকৰ এটা আকৰ্ষণ আছে যে ভাৰতীয় সকলৰ কেনেধৰণে তাক ব্যৱহাৰ কৰিছিল বা ভাৰতীয়সকলে কি ধৰণৰ পেইণ্টিঙৰ ওপৰত গুৰুত্ব দিছিল, সেই পেইণ্টিংখিনিৰ মাজত সাদৃশ্য বা বৈসাদৃশ্য তেওঁলোকে তুলনা বা অধ্যয়নৰ কাৰণে পৰ্যটকসকল আহে। গতিকে ইয়াৰ এতিয়া মূল কথা হৈছে তাৰ আৰু পৰ্যটনৰ কাৰণে উন্নয়নৰ ব্যৱস্থা কৰিব লাগিব, তেতিয়াহে পৰ্যটকসকল আকৰ্ষিত হ'ব, পৰ্যটকসকল আহিব। তাৰপিছত আমি দেখিবলৈ পাওঁ যে এই যে পেইণ্টিংবিলাক আছে তাত বহুত সৰু নাম্বাৰত আছে টুৰিষ্টবিলাক আহে, গতিকে তেওঁলোকৰ এট্ৰাকশ্যনটো কমি আছে। তাৰপিছতে সেই ছাইটবিলাকত টুৰিষ্টৰ যিটো ইনফ্ৰাষ্ট্ৰাকচাৰ ফেচিলিটিজ ডেভেলপ কৰিব লাগিব। তাৰপিছতে তাত হিষ্টৰিয়ান আৰু আৰ্কিঅলজিসকলে যিটো এটা প্ৰাইমাৰী ইণ্টাৰেষ্ট দিছে, সেইটো এটা ডাঙৰ সমস্যা হৈছে যে মাউণ্টেইন ৰেঞ্জ আৰু কানেকশ্যন যিটো তাৰ কানেক্টিভিটি এই মাউণ্টেইন ৰেঞ্জত হ'লে প'ৰলি কানেক্টেড হয়। গতিকে মেট্ৰপলিটান টাউনৰ পৰা তাত এটা দূৰত্ব থাকে ভাৰতৰ মেট্ৰপলিটান টাউনৰ পৰা। আৰু প্ৰি হিষ্টৰিক পেইণ্টিঙে যদি এটা মূল এটা টুৰিষ্টৰ আকৰ্ষণ হয়, নিশ্চিতভাৱে সেই ফালৰ পৰা যদি আমি ক'ব যাওঁ, আমি পৰামৰ্শ হিচাপে আগবঢ়াব যাওঁ যে তাত টুৰিষ্ট পইণ্টবিলাক তাত উন্নত কৰিব লাগে। যিহেতু আমি দেখিবলৈ পাইছোঁ যে হিষ্টৰিয়ানসকলেই হওক বা তাত যিবিলাক আৰ্কিঅলজিষ্ট আছে, তেওঁলোকে কৈছে যে তাত যিটো মাউণ্টেইন ৰেঞ্জত আছে, তাৰ মূল ঠাইৰ পৰা দূৰত্বত থাকে, গতিকে তাত বিভিন্ন অসুবিধা আছে। কিন্তু যিহেতু টুৰিষ্টসকলে তাত যাব খুজিছে আৰু যদি প্ৰাচীন চিত্ৰৰ এটা প্ৰাধান্য লাভ কৰে, আকৰ্ষণ হ'ব পাৰে, তেতিয়াহ'লে টুৰিষ্টক আকৰ্ষণ কৰিবৰ কাৰণে গভৰ্ণমেণ্টে, চৰকাৰে তেনেধৰণৰ ব্যৱস্থা হাতত ল'ব লাগে যাতে তাৰ উন্নতি সাধন হয় আৰু টুৰিষ্টসকলে তাত তেওঁলোকৰ চিত্ৰ দেখিবলৈ পায়, তাৰ পৰা তেওঁলোকে জ্ঞান লাভ কৰিব পাৰে, তেওঁলোকে শিকিব পাৰে, তেওঁলোকে জানিব পাৰে, তেওঁলোকে বুজিব পাৰে। এতিয়া কথা হ'ল যে আমি ইমানখিনি কথা আমি এতিয়ালৈকে জানিলোঁ যে ভাৰতৰ চিত্ৰশিল্প কেনেধৰণে ব্যৱহাৰ হৈছিল, প্ৰাচীন পাশ্চাত্যত কেনেধৰণে চিত্ৰশিল্প ব্যৱহাৰ হৈছিল, চিত্ৰশিল্প ধৰ্মৰ লগত কেনেধৰণে সম্পৰ্কিত হৈছে, বা প্ৰি হিষ্টৰিক কালত বা মধ্যম কালত বা ৰজাৰ দিনত, আৰু শিক্ষিত হোৱাৰ পিছত শিক্ষাৰ্থীসকলে, ছাত্ৰ ছাত্ৰী বুলি মই কোৱা নাই, এডুকেটেড পিপুলসকলে কেনেধৰণে চিত্ৰায়িত কৰিছিল। আৰু এতিয়া মূল কথাটো হৈছে আমি এইখিনিতে সামৰণি মাৰিছোঁ।